Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to thank all of you for your amazing support. Your comments make these videos even better, so don't forget to leave one below. If you enjoy true horror stories, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Now turn down the lights, and let's begin. The moment I set eyes on Lake Wanana, I knew I had made a terrible mistake accepting this post. It wasn't the isolation that bothered me. After all, I'd specifically requested a remote assignment. After 3 years as a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, dealing with endless tourist questions and parking violations, I was ready for something more authentic, something that would test me. But as my battered Ford Ranger crawled along the final stretch of unpaved road, the dense wall of ancient cedars suddenly broke to reveal the still, black waters of Lake Wanana stretching before me, and an inexplicable feeling of dread settled in my gut. Wanani was derived from a Salish word meaning shadow waters. According to the briefing packet I'd been given, the native tribes who once inhabited this region of the Pasaitan wilderness believed the lake was a sacred place, a threshold between worlds. They spoke of it with reverence and fear. Now I understood why. The ranger cabin sat on a small ridge overlooking the eastern shore. It was more substantial than I had expected. A sturdy structure built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, with rough-hewn logs blackened by decades of Pacific Northwest rain. A small dock extended into the water, where an aluminum boat was secured, gently bobbing in the wind-driven ripples. As I pulled up to the cabin, Ranger Sullivan emerged from the doorway. He was a grizzled veteran of the Forest Service, weeks away from retirement after 30 years of service. His sunburned face creased into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes as he approached my truck. "So, you're the new blood," he said, extending a calloused hand as I stepped out. "Thought they'd send someone older." "I requested the assignment," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. 2 years at Olympic and 3 at Rainier. I wanted something quieter. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, you got it, 50 miles to the nearest town, no cell service, just the radio for emergencies." He gestured toward the cabin. "Solar panels for basic power, propane for heat and cooking. Water from the well out back. It's good, comes from deep underground." I nodded, taking it all in. "How many visitors do you usually get?" Sullivan's laugh was short and harsh. "Not many. Occasional hikers in summer. Hunters in the fall, though they're not supposed to be here. This isn't exactly a tourist destination." "That's fine by me." "Is it?" Sullivan studied me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You know, most rangers request transfers out of here after a season. Some don't even last that long." "I'm not most rangers," he snorted. "That's what they all say." He turned toward the cabin. "Come on, I'll show you around." The interior was simple but functional. A main room with a wood stove, small kitchen area, and a desk with maps and logbooks. A bedroom with a twin bed and dresser, and a small bathroom with a shower that Sullivan warned only provided hot water when the sun's been cooperating. A generator sat outside for emergency power, though fuel had to be brought in by truck. "Your main job is monitoring," Sullivan explained as he showed me the patrol routes on a topographical map spread across the desk. "Check the trails for debris, maintain the boundary markers, keep an eye out for fires. Standard stuff." "What about wildlife?" Sullivan hesitated. "We've got black bears, obviously. Mountain lions. The usual predators. Nothing you haven't dealt with before." Something in his tone made me probe further. "Anything unusual I should know about?" His weather-beaten face remained neutral, but I noticed his fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the map. "There have been incidents over the years." "What kind of incidents?" "Missing hikers, mostly. People who venture off trail and get lost. It happens in any wilderness area." "But," Sullivan sighed, rolling up the map with deliberate care, "but the ones who do turn up don't always make sense of what happened to them. They talk about being followed, watched. Strange sounds at night." I raised an eyebrow. "Bears can be pretty intimidating to inexperienced hikers. That's what the official reports say." He placed the map in a metal tube and secured it in a cabinet. "Just keep your wits about you, especially at night. And stay out of the northern basin." "The northern basin?" Sullivan pointed through the window to where the lake curved around a densely forested peninsula. "Beyond that point, it's restricted. Environmental study area." "What are they studying?" "Above my pay grade." He checked his watch. "I need to head out if I'm going to make it to Winthrop before dark. The radio procedure is in the manual. Check in with headquarters every morning at 0800 and again at 1700. Any questions?" I had dozens, but something told me Sullivan wasn't going to provide satisfying answers. I shook my head. "Good." He grabbed his duffel bag from beside the door. One more thing. If you hear anything unusual at night, stay inside, no matter what it sounds like." With that cryptic warning, Sullivan departed, the sound of his truck fading into the distance until all I could hear was the whisper of wind through the cedars and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I spent the remainder of the afternoon familiarizing myself with the cabin and its surroundings. The logbooks were meticulously maintained, documenting weather conditions, wildlife sightings, and the occasional visitor. Sullivan had been diligent, but I noticed gaps in the entries during the winter months. Sometimes weeks would pass without a single note. As darkness fell, I lit the wood stove and prepared a simple dinner from the supplies I'd brought. The cabin creaked and settled around me, the sounds amplified in the profound silence of the wilderness. Through the window, the moonlight cast a silver path across the lake's surface, illuminating wisps of fog that drifted like phantoms above the water. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard it, a long, mournful cry echoing across the lake. It wasn't quite a howl, nor was it the scream of a mountain lion. It was something in between, with an almost human quality that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Remembering Sullivan's warning, I extinguished the lantern and moved to the window. The moonlight revealed nothing unusual along the shoreline or in the surrounding forest, but as I watched, the fog on the lake seemed to thicken and coalesce, forming shapes that moved against the wind before dissolving back into formless mist. The cry came again, closer this time. Then silence, broken only by the irregular tempo of my heartbeat. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps a loon, though Sullivan hadn't mentioned loons in his wildlife inventory. I checked the locks on the doors and windows before climbing into bed, drawing the blankets tight around me despite the warmth from the wood stove. Sleep came eventually, but it was restless and plagued by dreams of dark waters and half-glimpsed shapes moving through the trees. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I found myself standing on the dock, staring into the depths of the lake. Something enormous moved beneath the surface, circling slowly before rising toward me. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the weathered planks. Just as a vast, shadowy form was about to break the surface, I awoke with a gasp. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the curtains. I lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop from the dying embers in the wood stove. I rose and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to survey the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the pinkish glow of the morning sky. Nothing seemed amiss, until I noticed the footprints on the shore. They started at the water's edge and led directly to the cabin, stopping just below my window. They were huge, at least 16 inches long, and deeply impressed in the wet soil. The stride length was enormous, suggesting whatever made them stood well over 7 feet tall. My first instinct was to dismiss them as a prank, Sullivan's parting gift perhaps, but as I studied them more closely through the window, I knew no human could have made these prints. The shape was all wrong, wider at the front with 5 distinct toe impressions, narrowing to a rounded heel. They resembled a human footprint only in the most general sense. I grabbed my camera and hurried outside, careful to avoid disturbing the tracks. The morning air was crisp and heavy with moisture, the scent of cedar and pine mingling with the earthy aroma of the lake. I photographed the prints from multiple angles, placing my own boot next to one for scale. The difference was disturbing. Following the tracks backward, I found where they emerged from the water. Following them forward, they stopped abruptly beneath my window, as if whatever made them had stood there watching me sleep. There were no tracks leading away. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. I wasn't alone out here. Something had visited in the night, something large enough to leave prints that dwarfed my own. I knew what the locals would call it, what any cryptozoology enthusiast would immediately suggest. But I was a ranger, trained in wildlife biology. I didn't believe in monsters or myths. At least I didn't before Lake Wanauna. The radio crackled to life precisely at 0800. Wanauna Station, this is Northwest Dispatch. Morning check-in, over. I grabbed the handset, hesitating. Should I report the footprints? My scientific training battled with what I'd seen with my own eyes. Northwest Dispatch, this is Wanauna Station. All normal here, I finally responded. Weather clear, temperature approximately 45 degrees. No incidents to report. Copy that, Wanauna. Sullivan make it out okay? Yes, he departed yesterday evening. Welcome to Solitude, Ranger. Remember, morning and evening check-ins are mandatory. Miss 2 in a row and we send a helicopter. Anything else to report? My eyes drifted to the window, where I could still see the massive footprints in the soil. No, nothing else. Copy that. Northwest Dispatch out. I replaced the handset and stood there for a long moment, questioning my decision. The rational part of my brain insisted there must be a logical explanation for the tracks, perhaps some unknown species of bear walking on its hind legs, or even an elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew neither explanation fit what I'd seen. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my pack, sidearm, and camera, determined to investigate. The patrol route Sullivan had shown me covered most of the southern portion of the lake and the surrounding forest, but deliberately avoided the northern basin, the restricted area he'd mentioned. The tracks led in that direction. I followed the shoreline, moving cautiously and stopping frequently to listen. The forest was alive with normal sounds: the chatter of squirrels, the distant drumming of woodpeckers, the rustle of wind through the canopy. Yet there was an underlying tension, a sense of being observed that I couldn't shake. About a mile from the cabin, I found another set of the massive prints, these emerging from the forest and leading into the water. They were fresher than the ones near the cabin, the edges still crisp. Whatever made them had entered the lake not long ago. I photographed these as well, then scanned the opposite shore with my binoculars. Nothing moved along the tree line, but as I panned across the peninsula that separated the main lake from the northern basin, I caught a glimpse of something unusual, a flash of metal among the trees. Adjusting the focus, I could make out what appeared to be some sort of structure, partially concealed by the dense vegetation. It wasn't on any of Sullivan's maps. My curiosity overrode my caution. I returned to the cabin, retrieved the aluminum boat, and set out across the lake. The water was deeper than I expected, the surface like black glass reflecting the encircling mountains. Occasionally, ripples would form with no apparent cause, as if something large was moving deep below. As I approached the peninsula, the sense of being watched intensified. The forest here was older, the trees massive and draped with hanging moss that stirred in the absence of wind. I secured the boat to a fallen log and proceeded on foot, moving as quietly as possible. The structure was approximately half a mile inland. A small, windowless building constructed of concrete and metal, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A heavy padlock secured the gate, and signs warned, "Government property, no unauthorized access. Violators will be prosecuted." There were no identifying markings to indicate which government agency operated the facility, no vehicles, and no signs of recent human activity. The whole setup reminded me of the remote monitoring stations used by the USGS to track seismic activity. Except those didn't typically require security fencing or look like miniature bunkers. I circled the perimeter, keeping a safe distance. On the far side, I discovered a clearing where the forest had been cut back to create a small helicopter landing pad. The painted markings faded but still visible. Whatever this place was, it was accessed primarily by air. As I prepared to leave, something caught my eye. A motion-activated camera mounted on one of the fence posts, its lens pointed directly at me. A red light blinked steadily, indicating it was recording. So much for remaining unnoticed. I retreated into the forest, intending to return to my boat. But as I navigated through the dense underbrush, I realized I'd lost my bearings. The canopy was so thick here that I couldn't see the sun to orient myself. I reached for my compass only to find it spinning erratically, unable to fix on magnetic north. For the first time, genuine alarm took hold. I was an experienced ranger, well-trained in wilderness navigation. Getting lost like this shouldn't happen. I forced myself to remain calm, listening for the sound of the lake. Water carries sound, and I hadn't gone far enough to lose audio contact with the lapping waves. But the forest was unnaturally silent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. Even the insects had fallen quiet. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles beneath my boots. Then I heard it, a heavy footfall behind me, followed by another. Something large was moving through the forest, paralleling my path. I turned slowly, hand dropping to my sidearm. The undergrowth parted about 50 yards away, and for a brief moment I saw it, a massive, dark figure standing upright among the trees. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be dark, matted fur. Its proportions were vaguely human but wrong somehow. The arms too long, the shoulders too broad. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, it stepped backward into the deeper shadows and was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. Fight or flight took over, and I crashed through the forest in what I hoped was the direction of the lake. Branches slashed at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. I burst through the tree line at the shore, but in a different location from where I'd left my boat. Scanning frantically in both directions, I spotted it about a quarter mile to the south. I sprinted along the rocky beach, expecting at any moment to feel powerful hands close around me from behind. When I reached the boat, I shoved it into the water and scrambled aboard, not stopping to remove my boots or roll up my pants. The outboard motor coughed twice before catching, and I angled the boat toward the distant cabin, pushing the small engine to its limits. Halfway across, I cut the motor and drifted, watching the peninsula through my binoculars. The shoreline remained empty. If whatever I'd seen had pursued me, it remained hidden among the trees. But as I prepared to restart the engine, something large broke the surface of the water about 100 yards away. It was gone before I could focus my binoculars, just a dark shape that rolled smoothly back beneath the surface, leaving concentric ripples expanding outward. I revved the engine to full throttle, no longer caring about noise or appearances. The boat skimmed across the water, bouncing painfully over its own wake. When I finally reached the cabin's dock, I secured the boat with trembling hands and retreated inside, locking the door behind me. At the desk, I opened the logbook, intending to document my experience. But as the pen hovered over the blank page, I hesitated. What exactly had I seen? A bear? A moose? My rational mind grasped for explanations, but none fit the figure I'd glimpsed in the forest. And what about the structure on the peninsula? Its presence raised more questions than answers. Was it monitoring the lake, the surrounding forest, or something else entirely? In the end, I made a simple entry. Investigated Northern Peninsula. Discovered restricted federal installation. Wildlife abundant but cautious. Not a lie, but far from the complete truth. As evening approached, I radioed in for my mandatory check-in, again reporting that all was normal. After signing off, I stood at the window watching the light fade from the sky, casting the lake into deepening shadow. In the gathering darkness, I could almost convince myself that the day's events had been a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. Almost? I secured the cabin for the night, checking and rechecking the locks. I cleaned my sidearm and left it on the bedside table within easy reach. Outside, an owl called, its mournful hooting carried on the night breeze. Ordinary forest sounds, but as I settled into bed, the same cry I'd heard the previous night echoed across the lake, that strange, not quite human howl that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was answered by another, more distant cry from somewhere deep in the forest. They weren't hunting calls or territorial warnings. They sounded almost like communication. Sleep eluded me for hours, my mind replaying the glimpse of that tall, dark figure among the trees. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadowy forms moving beneath the black waters of Lake Winauna, rising toward the surface with purpose. I awoke to the sound of something heavy moving around the exterior of the cabin. Wood creaked as weight shifted against the walls. Through the window, I could see it was still dark, the forest illuminated only by the faint light of a waning moon. The scratching came next. Slow, deliberate drags along the outer logs, as if something with long claws was testing the structure's integrity. It moved methodically around the perimeter, pausing occasionally as if listening. I lay frozen in bed, the blankets pulled to my chin, hardly daring to breathe. My hand crept toward the sidearm on the bedside table, fingers closing around the grip. When the scratching reached the window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a massive silhouette briefly visible against the night sky. Then came a soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass, almost like knuckles rapping gently for attention. I remained motionless, gun trained on the window, heart pounding so loudly I was certain whatever was outside could hear it. The tapping stopped. Long moments passed in silence. Then, from just outside the wall nearest my head came a sound that sent ice through my veins, a low, rumbling vocalization that was almost, but not quite, words. It rose and fell in a pattern that suggested language, but unlike any I'd ever heard. It was trying to speak. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. Morning revealed new tracks around the cabin, deeper than before. Whatever had circled the structure in the night was even larger than I'd initially thought. The scratches on the outer walls were clearly visible, long, parallel grooves in the weathered wood, some as high as 9 feet above the ground. Most disturbing were the markings on a large cedar tree at the edge of the clearing. The bark had been stripped away in a deliberate pattern, creating what appeared to be a crude symbol, a vertical line bisected by 3 horizontal slashes. It hadn't been there the day before. I spent the morning securing the cabin further, checking for weak points and ensuring all entrances were reinforced. As I worked, I tried to process what was happening. My scientific training warred with what I was experiencing. Logic insisted there must be a rational explanation. Perhaps a rogue bear with unusual behaviors, or even someone in a costume attempting to frighten me away. But neither explanation accounted for the intelligence behind the scratching pattern, the deliberate creation of symbols, or the vocalizations that seemed designed to communicate. At 0800, I made my scheduled radio check-in, again reporting all normal. I considered mentioning the tracks and scratches, but held back. Without context, it would sound like I was either lying or losing my mind. I needed more concrete evidence. After the call, I reviewed the photographs I'd taken of the footprints. They remained unexplainable by conventional wildlife biology. The shape, size, and stride length matched no known species in the Pacific Northwest, yet they were real. I hadn't imagined them. My thoughts turned to the restricted installation on the peninsula. Was there a connection? The facility's presence in such a remote location couldn't be coincidental. It had to be monitoring something. And given its position overlooking the northern basin, that something was likely in or around the lake. I needed more information, but my unplanned visit had almost certainly been recorded by the security camera. Someone knew I'd been there. Would they come to investigate, or were they already watching me? The radio crackled unexpectedly, making me jump. Wanawana Station. This is Northwest Dispatch, over. Strange. They never called outside scheduled check-ins unless there was an emergency. I grabbed the handset. Northwest Dispatch. This is Wanawana Station. Over. We're patching through a call from Regional Command. Stand by. There was a burst of static, then a new voice. Deeper, more authoritative. Wanawana Station. This is Regional Director Blackwood. We've received reports of unauthorized activity in a restricted area under your jurisdiction. Can you confirm? My mouth went dry. Sir, I conducted a standard patrol of the area yesterday and may have inadvertently crossed into a marked restricted zone. I was establishing my boundaries. That area is clearly marked on your maps as off-limits, Ranger. It's a sensitive research installation. May I ask what kind of research is being conducted there? There was a pause. That information is classified. However, I can tell you it's a long-term environmental monitoring project. Has there been any unusual activity in your area recently? Any wildlife disturbances? The scratches on the cabin walls flashed in my mind. The footprints. The dark shape in the forest. Nothing significant to report, sir. Another pause. Longer this time. I see. A research team will be arriving by helicopter tomorrow to inspect the installation. They'll need access to your cabin as a base of operations. Please make the necessary preparations. Understood, sir. One more thing, Ranger. For your own safety, maintain your distance from the northern basin. If you observe any unusual wildlife, do not approach. Report it immediately through secure channels. Is that clear? Crystal clear, sir. Regional Command out. The radio fell silent, leaving me with more questions than answers. They were coming tomorrow, not just to check the installation, but to check on me. And what did Blackwood mean by unusual wildlife? He knew something. They were monitoring something specific. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. I cleaned the cabin, organized my notes, and secured the photographs I'd taken. If the research team was looking for evidence that I'd seen something, they wouldn't find it easily. By evening, low clouds had rolled in, bringing a light drizzle that shrouded the lake in mist. The falling darkness seemed more oppressive than usual, the shadows deeper and more substantial. I completed my evening check-in, then heated a can of stew on the propane stove, my appetite diminished by the day's events. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. The cabin's windows, now revealing only my own reflection against the night, seemed to conceal watching eyes beyond the glass. Occasionally, the mist would shift, forming shapes that dissolved when I tried to focus on them. I was nearly finished with my meal when the power went out. The solar system should have provided enough stored energy to last through the night, even without direct sunlight during the day. I lit a kerosene lantern and checked the electrical panel. No obvious issues there. Moving to the window, I peered out at the small shed that housed the batteries and inverter. The security light that normally illuminated it was dark, but in the glow from my lantern I could see the shed door standing open, swinging gently in the breeze. I definitely hadn't left it that way. My sidearm felt reassuring against my hip as I pulled on a rain jacket and stepped onto the porch, lantern held high. The rain had intensified, driven by gusts of wind that sent sheets of water across the clearing. Visibility was poor, the lantern's glow creating a small bubble of light surrounded by impenetrable darkness. I moved cautiously toward the shed, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing seemed amiss until I reached the small structure and looked inside. The battery connections had been deliberately severed, the heavy cables pulled apart with significant force. No animal could have done this. It was too precise, too targeted. Someone or something had intentionally cut power to the cabin. A branch snapped in the forest, the sound carrying clearly despite the rain. I spun toward it, hand dropping to my weapon. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting making my position known. "This is a Federal Ranger station. Identify yourself." No response came from the darkness. But as I swept the lantern in a slow arc, the light briefly caught a pair of eyes reflecting at the forest's edge. large, widely spaced, and positioned at a height that could only belong to something standing well over 7 feet tall. They blinked once, then vanished. I backed toward the cabin, keeping the lantern extended to maximize my field of vision. The rain plastered my hair to my scalp, running in rivulets down my face and neck. Each step seemed to take an eternity, the distance to the safety of the cabin stretching impossibly. When my foot hit the bottom porch step, I heard it. That same vocalization from the previous night, but louder now, more insistent. It came from directly behind me. I whirled, drawing my weapon in the same motion. The lantern swung wildly, casting chaotic shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. For a brief, terrifying moment, the illumination fell on a massive figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Broad-shouldered, covered in dark fur matted by the rain, its face concealed by shadow, but its eyes reflecting the lantern's glow with an almost human intelligence. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness with surprising speed for something so large. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I bolted into the cabin, slammed the door, and threw both locks. My hands shook so badly I could barely manage the simple task. Without power, the cabin's interior was cold and unwelcoming. The shadows beyond my lantern's reach deep and alive with imagined movement. I placed the light on the table and retrieved my satellite phone from my pack, the emergency device I'd been instructed to use only in genuine crises. This qualified. I dialed the emergency contact number, but before it could connect, the signal died. No service. Even the satellite connection, which should have functioned regardless of my remote location, was somehow blocked. Outside, something heavy circled the cabin. I could hear its footsteps in the wet soil, the occasional brush of what might have been a hand against the outer walls. It was testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. I retreated to the bedroom, weapon ready, back against the wall furthest from the windows. The rain intensified, hammering on the roof like impatient fingers. Thunder rumbled in the distance, momentarily drowning out the sounds of whatever stalked the perimeter. But when the thunder faded, a new sound emerged. A rhythmic tapping on the bedroom window, too deliberate to be caused by the storm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. I raised my gun, aiming at the window. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking with strain. "Leave me alone." The tapping stopped abruptly. Silence stretched, broken only by the rain and my own ragged breathing. Then, softly at first but growing steadily louder, came a sound that froze my blood. A series of vocalizations that unmistakably mimicked my own words. Go, awa, leave, alone. The voice was deep, guttural, the words mangled but recognizable. It wasn't just mimicry. There was intent behind it, a crude attempt at communication. "What are you?" I whispered, though I knew the question was absurd. Whatever was outside couldn't possibly answer in a way I'd understand, but it tried. "Wanauna," came the growled response. Then again, more insistently, "Wanauna," the name of the lake, or perhaps what it really meant, Shadow Waters. The threshold between worlds. A massive fist hammered against the window frame, rattling the glass in its mounting. The creature, because I could no longer pretend it was anything else, was growing impatient. I backed further away, pressing myself into the corner, weapon trained on the window. If the glass broke, if it came through, but it didn't. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Footsteps retreated, heavy splashes indicating movement toward the lake. Then silence, save for the relentless percussion of the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I maintained my vigil in the corner, jumping at every creak of the cabin's timbers, every gust of wind that moaned through the eaves. The lantern burned steadily, creating a small haven of light in the darkness, but its fuel wouldn't last forever. Dawn arrived with aching slowness, the gray light of morning gradually revealing an empty clearing around the cabin. No massive figure lurked at the tree line, no eyes watched from the shadows, but the evidence of the night's visitor remained. New footprints in the mud, deeper than before, and something else. A crude arrangement of broken branches on the porch, forming the same symbol that had been carved into the cedar tree. A message, a warning, or an invitation. The helicopter arrived precisely at noon, its rhythmic thump-thump-thump growing steadily louder until it appeared over the tree line, a sleek black shape against the overcast sky. It circled the cabin once before settling onto the small clearing near the dock, its rotors whipping the lake into frothy wavelets. I stood on the porch, watching as 4 figures disembarked. 3 men and a woman, all dressed in identical dark rain gear with no identifying insignia. They carried equipment cases and duffel bags, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a team accustomed to working together. The apparent leader approached while the others unloaded gear. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that revealed nothing. "Ranger," he said by way of greeting, extending a hand. "Dr. Lawrence, Environmental Research Division. Which department?" I asked, accepting the handshake. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Just the department will do. These are my colleagues, Dr. Chen, Mr. Reyes, and Ms. Bennett." The others nodded in acknowledgement but remained focused on their tasks. None appeared particularly friendly. "You've lost power," Lawrence observed, glancing at the dark windows of the cabin. "Equipment failure during the storm last night," I replied, careful to keep my tone neutral. "The battery connections were damaged. We'll have our technician look at it." He studied me with clinical detachment. "Rough night?" I realized how I must appear. Unshaven, clothing rumpled, dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep. "The storm kept me up," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Lawrence nodded, not quite believing me. "We'll need to use your cabin as a base of operations for the next few days." Regional Director Blackwood explained this. He did. "May I ask exactly what you're researching?" "Environmental anomalies," Lawrence replied vaguely. "Long-term ecological surveillance. Nothing that should interfere with your duties." Before I could press further, the woman Bennett approached, carrying what looked like a specialized scanner. "Site secure, Doctor," she reported. "No unauthorized signals or devices detected." Lawrence nodded. "Excellent. Ranger, perhaps you could show us inside." The team efficiently transformed my simple cabin into an operations center. Electronic equipment appeared from their cases, filling the main room with screens, keyboards, and devices I couldn't identify. Reyes, the youngest member of the group, restored power within minutes, though he seemed puzzled by the damage to the battery connections. "This was an equipment failure," he told Lawrence quietly, though I overheard from the kitchen where I was preparing coffee. "The cables were forcibly separated. Something strong did this." Lawrence's eyes flicked toward me momentarily. "Documented and repair the damage. Full security protocol." Chen, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses, established a satellite uplink that seemed far more powerful than standard communications gear. Within an hour, they had created a self-contained command post, complete with monitoring equipment pointed toward the northern basin. I tried to make myself useful, answering questions about the local terrain and weather patterns, all while observing their operation. They were clearly not standard environmental researchers. Their equipment, their demeanor, the practiced way they secured the perimeter, these were the hallmarks of a military or intelligence operation. As evening approached, Lawrence and Bennett prepared to depart for the installation on the peninsula, leaving Chen and Reyes to monitor the equipment. I offered to guide them, mentioning my previous visit to the site. "That won't be necessary," Lawrence replied, checking a compact GPS unit. "We know the way." "The terrain can be disorienting," I persisted. "Compasses don't work reliably near the northern basin." This caught Lawrence's attention. "You've noticed magnetic anomalies?" Among other things, his eyes narrowed. "What exactly have you observed since arriving, Ranger?" I hesitated, weighing my options. These people knew more than they were revealing. If I wanted answers, I needed to show some of my cards. "Unusual tracks around the cabin," I said carefully. "Large, bipedal, not consistent with known wildlife. And last night, something deliberately disabled the power and attempted to communicate." Bennett and Lawrence exchanged glances. "Communicate how?" Bennett asked, her professional detachment slipping slightly. "Vocalization, mimicry of human speech, and symbols, arrangements of branches in specific patterns." Lawrence's expression hardened. "You should have reported this immediately through proper channels." "To whom?" "Regional Director Blackwood, who didn't see fit to warn me what I was dealing with. Or perhaps to Ranger Sullivan, who left me with cryptic warnings but no actual information." "You weren't briefed because you didn't need to know," Lawrence replied coldly. "Your job is to maintain the ranger station and report unusual activities, nothing more." "Well, I'm reporting now," I countered. "Something is out there, something intelligent, and I think you know exactly what it is." A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft beep of the monitoring equipment. Finally, Lawrence sighed. "Ms. Bennett, please continue preparations for our departure. I need a private word with the ranger." Bennett hesitated, then nodded, moving outside with her equipment pack. Lawrence turned to me, his authoritarian demeanor softening slightly. "What I'm about to tell you is classified, Ranger. Officially, this conversation never happened." "Understood." He lowered his voice, despite Chen and Reyes being occupied on the far side of the room. "Lake Winona has been a research site for nearly 50 years. What began as a standard geological survey in the 1970s quickly became something else when the team encountered anomalous entities. Bigfoot, I said bluntly. Lawrence winced at the term. We avoid that particular nomenclature. We classify them as non-human intelligences, or NHIs. There's a small population in this region, perhaps the largest concentration in North America. How is that possible? How could they remain hidden for so long? They're intelligent, highly adaptable, and extremely territorial. They've learned to avoid human contact, with a few exceptions. He gestured toward the window. This area is ideal. Remote, difficult to access, abundant food sources, and natural features that somehow interfere with technology and human perception. The magnetic anomalies, among other things. We believe they can manipulate their environment in ways we don't fully understand. It's why compasses fail, why satellite phones malfunction, why people become disoriented in the northern basin. I processed this information, trying to reconcile it with my scientific worldview. If you've known about them for decades, why keep it secret? The scientific significance alone. Lawrence cut me off. Can you imagine the consequences of public confirmation, the media circus, the hordes of cryptid hunters invading the wilderness? Not to mention the philosophical and religious implications of another intelligent species sharing our planet. He had a point. The public revelation of such a discovery would be earth-shaking on multiple levels. So what's your role? I asked. Observation? Containment? Protection, Lawrence replied, surprising me. Both theirs and ours. We maintain this as a sanctuary of sorts, ensuring they remain undisturbed while preventing potentially dangerous interactions with humans. Most hikers or rangers who stumble upon evidence are easy to discredit. A few require more active management. The implication was clear. Is that why rangers keep requesting transfers from this station? Are they being intimidated into leaving? Not by us, Lawrence said meaningfully. The NHIs themselves prefer certain humans over others. They seem to tolerate some, actively avoid most, and occasionally become curious about individuals like yourself. Curious? It tried to break into the cabin last night. If it wanted to enter, it would have. They're testing you, assessing your intentions. The fact that you're still alive suggests they find you interesting. Before I could respond, Bennett appeared at the door. Doctor, we need to depart now if we want to reach the installation before dark. Lawrence nodded. We'll continue this discussion later, Ranger. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you remain in the cabin until we return. The NHIs are more active at night, and they may be agitated by our presence. With that, he joined Bennett outside, and the two departed along the shore toward the peninsula, quickly disappearing into the thick undergrowth. Chen and Reyes continued their work, largely ignoring me except to request coffee or ask basic questions about the cabin's utilities. The monitoring equipment emitted occasional beeps and chirps, but they kept the screens angled away from my view. As darkness fell, I found myself watching the tree line through the window, half expecting to see massive shapes moving in the shadows. The forest remained still, but the sense of being observed was stronger than ever. They're out there, aren't they? I asked, breaking the silence. Reyes glanced up from his equipment. Multiple signatures on thermal. At least 3 individuals, maintaining distance but definitely watching. They always watch, Chen added without looking up from his tablet. It's what they do, and this doesn't concern you. Chen shrugged. We're used to it. They rarely approach when we're here in numbers. They're cautious, especially around unfamiliar technology, but they approached me, alone. You're new, Reyes explained. They're establishing boundaries, determining if you're a threat. It's a standard pattern. There's nothing standard about a creature that can mimic human speech and create symbolic messages. I countered. This earned me a sharp look from Chen. They mimicked you? What exactly did they say? I recounted the previous night's encounter, the repetition of my words, the utterance of "wana wana," the pounding on the window. Chen's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing genuine excitement. Fascinating. We've documented limited vocalization before, but direct mimicry of human speech is rare. They must be particularly interested in you. Lucky me, I muttered. The satellite radio on their console crackled to life. Base, this is Lawrence. We've reached the installation, all systems operational, but there are signs of recent NHI activity in the vicinity. Multiple track patterns, some fresh. They've been very active since the storm. Confirmed, Reyes responded. We're tracking 3 signatures around the cabin perimeter, maintaining approximately 200 meters distance. Keep me updated on any changes. We'll remain here overnight to collect data. Lawrence out. As the connection closed, the cabin lights flickered momentarily. Reyes and Chen immediately turned to their equipment, checking readings. Power fluctuation, Chen reported. But the backup systems are stable. They're testing again, Reyes said quietly, probing our defenses. I thought you said they maintain their distance when you're here, I reminded them. Usually, Chen acknowledged. But they've been increasingly bold over the past year. Something's changed in their behavior patterns. What kind of defenses do you have? I asked, suddenly very interested in our security situation. Reyes pointed to small devices mounted in the corners of the cabin, things I'd initially mistaken for smoke detectors. Acoustic deterrents. They emit frequencies that the NHIs find uncomfortable, not harmful, just unpleasant enough to discourage close approach. And if those fail, Chen patted a hard-sided case beside his workstation. We have more direct countermeasures if necessary, but it rarely comes to that. The reassurance did little to calm my nerves. I checked my sidearm, ensuring it was loaded and accessible. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving light rain against the windows in irregular patterns. The forest sounds were muted, as if the wildlife sensed the tension and had retreated to safer locations. What do they want? I asked, more to myself than my companions. Chen looked up, his expression serious. That's the question we've been trying to answer for decades. They were here long before us, living in isolation until human expansion began to encroach on their territory. Now they're caught between worlds, unable to fully retreat from human civilization, yet unwilling or unable to reveal themselves completely. Communication attempts have increased in frequency over the past 5 years, Reyes added. The branch symbols, rock arrangements, vocalization experiments. They're trying to establish contact on their terms. Or warning us away, I suggested. Perhaps both, Chen conceded. Their social structure and motivations remain largely unknown despite years of observation. We know they're highly intelligent, possess complex communication systems, and demonstrate remarkable adaptability. Beyond that, he shrugged. The lights flickered again, more pronounced this time. One of the monitoring devices emitted a sharp tone. Movement, Reyes reported, studying a thermal display. Their closing distance, all 3 signatures converging on the eastern perimeter. Chen activated a control on his console. A high-pitched whine, just at the edge of human hearing, emanated from the corner devices. I felt it more than heard it. A pressure in my ears that was mildly uncomfortable. That should discourage them, Chen said confidently, but the thermal display told a different story. The signatures continued to approach, undeterred by the acoustic countermeasure. Increase the frequency, Chen instructed. Reyes adjusted a dial, and the pressure in my ears intensified, making me wince. Still, the heat signatures advanced. This isn't right, Reyes muttered. They've never ignored the deterrents before. Chen reached for the hard-sided case, unlatching it to reveal what looked like modified flare guns. We may need to. The cabin plunged into darkness as the power failed completely. Even the battery backup systems went dead. The only illumination came from the faint glow of emergency chemical lights that automatically activated near the exits. In the sudden silence that followed, we could hear them clearly. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin, not just 3 sets but many, moving with purpose and coordination. Something heavy dragged across the exterior wall, a deliberate slow scraping that raised the hairs on my neck. Get down, Chen hissed, distributing the flare guns, away from the windows. We crouched in the center of the room, back to back, weapons ready. The scraping continued, moving systematically around the structure. Then came the vocalizations, deep rumbling sounds that overlapped and intertwined, creating patterns that almost but not quite resembled language. They're coordinating, Reyes whispered. I've never seen them work together like this. The satellite radio remained silent. No contact from Lawrence and Bennett at the installation. We were on our own. A tremendous blow struck the front door, powerful enough to splinter the frame. Another followed, and the hinges began to separate from the wall. If they breach, aim for the center mass, Chen instructed, his voice remarkably steady. The flares won't kill them, but the light and heat will drive them back. The pounding intensified, the door buckling inward with each impact. Wood cracked, metal groaned, and for the first time I genuinely believed I might not survive the night. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault stopped. The vocalization ceased. The forest fell silent. We remained frozen in our defensive posture, waiting for the attack to resume. Minutes stretched into agonizing uncertainty. What happened? I finally whispered. Neither Chen nor Reyes had an answer. We maintained our position, unwilling to investigate but unable to relax. The answer came with the distant thump of helicopter rotors. Reinforcements, Chen breathed, relief evident in his voice. Lawrence must have called for backup when we lost contact. The sound grew louder, and soon the clearing outside was illuminated by powerful searchlights mounted on a military-grade helicopter. The downdraft bent the surrounding trees, creating a maelstrom of wind and rain around the cabin. Voices shouted commands outside. Flashlight beams swept the perimeter. The cavalry had arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The creatures, the NHIs, had been on the verge of breaching the cabin. Why retreat just because of an approaching helicopter? Based on everything I'd witnessed, they were intelligent enough to complete their assault before reinforcements arrived, unless that wasn't their objective at all. As armed personnel secured the area and restored emergency power to the cabin, I stared out the window at the dark forest beyond the helicopter's lights. What had they really wanted? Why coordinate such a show of force only to withdraw at the critical moment? The answer, I suspected, lay somewhere in the northern basin, in the shadow waters of Lake Wanana, where worlds met and ancient intelligences waited. Dawn revealed the extent of the night's events. The cabin's door hung precariously from a single hinge, deep gouges marked the exterior walls, and massive footprints surrounded the structure in patterns suggesting at least 6 different individuals had participated in the assault. More disturbing were the symbols. Dozens of them, carved into tree trunks, arranged in stone patterns on the ground, even scratched into the cabin's window glass. All variations of the same motif. A vertical line intersected by 3 horizontal strokes. The reinforcements, a specialized security team of 8 personnel under the command of a stone-faced woman who introduced herself only as captain, had established a defensive perimeter around the cabin. They carried military-grade weapons and moved with the practiced efficiency of Special Forces operators. Dr. Lawrence and Miss Bennett had returned from the installation at first light, both looking grim. Lawrence pulled me aside as the security team debriefed Chen and Reyes. The installation was a diversion, he explained, his voice low. While we were there, monitoring equipment recorded unusual activity in the northern basin. We believe they wanted to draw us away from the cabin. Why? I asked, still struggling to understand the creature's motivations. Lawrence hesitated. We're not entirely sure. But given the coordinated nature of their actions, they must have had a specific objective, which was. He glanced toward the lake, expression troubled. Possibly you. Me? Why would they? As I mentioned yesterday, they sometimes develop an interest in specific individuals. Your reports of direct communication attempts suggest you've triggered their curiosity or their hostility. The two aren't mutually exclusive in their culture, Lawrence noted. But if they'd wanted to harm you, they could have easily done so before our arrival. Captain approached, cutting our conversation short. The perimeter is secure, Dr. Lawrence. No signs of immediate threat, but we've detected movement in the forest approximately 1 kilometer north. Maintaining distance but watching, Lawrence nodded. Typical behavior after an engagement. We should evacuate while we have the opportunity, she advised. The helicopter can transport everyone to the forward operating base. We can return with a full containment team if necessary. Lawrence considered this, then shook his head. Not yet. I want to understand why they've escalated to this degree. There must be a reason. With respect, Doctor, we can analyze their behavior from a safe distance. The risk of remaining is acceptable, Lawrence interrupted. We've been studying them for decades without a direct confrontation like this. Something has changed, and I need to know what. The captain clearly disapproved but didn't argue further. As you wish. But my team will maintain combat readiness, and the helicopter will remain on standby for immediate extraction. After she departed, Lawrence turned back to me. I need your help, Ranger. You've had more direct interaction with them than anyone on our team. They've attempted communication with you specifically. What exactly do you want me to do? Help us understand what they're trying to convey. These symbols, the vocalizations, it's a language of sorts. We've documented similar patterns over the years, but never in such concentration. I studied one of the carvings on a nearby tree. This doesn't look like any Native American symbology I'm familiar with. It's not, Lawrence confirmed. At least, not exactly. There are similarities to some ancient pictographs found in caves throughout the Pacific Northwest. But these are distinct, and you think I can somehow interpret them? I think they want you to. Why else focus their communication efforts on your cabin? On you specifically? It was a fair question, but one I had no answer for. What did these creatures see in me that made them single me out? Throughout the day, the security team maintained their vigilant perimeter while the researchers documented every symbol, footprint, and mark left by the nocturnal visitors. I assisted where I could, but mostly found myself studying the northern basin across the lake, drawn to it for reasons I couldn't articulate. As evening approached, Lawrence called a briefing in the cabin, now repaired enough to be functional if not comfortable. Maps were spread across the table, monitoring equipment beeped softly in the background, and the security team maintained a visible presence outside. We've analyzed the pattern of activity over the past 72 hours, Lawrence began, highlighting areas on the topographical map. The NHIs have been unusually active here, and here, all concentrated around the northern basin. Additionally, our underwater sensors have detected significant movement beneath the lake's surface. Underwater? I interrupted. These creatures swim? They're highly adapted to this environment, Lawrence explained. We believe they use underwater caves and tunnels to move throughout the region, possibly accessing areas we can't easily monitor. The lake reaches depths of over 300 feet in the northern basin, Chen added. Sonar mapping suggests extensive cave systems beneath the surrounding mountains, many of which may connect to the lake. Lawrence pointed to a specific location on the map, a narrow inlet on the far side of the northern basin, almost entirely enclosed by steep cliffs. This area has shown the most activity. We call it the threshold. Threshold to what? I asked. That's what we've been trying to determine for decades, Lawrence admitted. Native legends speak of Lake Winona as a boundary between worlds, a place where the veil is thin. Scientifically, we've recorded unusual electromagnetic phenomena there, temporal anomalies, and geological features that don't conform to standard models. You're saying it's what, a doorway to another dimension? Lawrence frowned at my skeptical tone. I'm saying there are aspects of this location that defy conventional explanation. The NHIs seem drawn to it, particularly during certain lunar and solar cycles. Like now, Chen interjected. Tomorrow night's lunar phase coincides with a peak in the electromagnetic field fluctuations we've been monitoring, which may explain their increased activity, Lawrence concluded. They're preparing for something. The captain, who had been listening silently from the doorway, spoke up. All the more reason to evacuate before whatever they're preparing for happens. Lawrence shook his head. This is precisely what we've been waiting years to observe. We're not leaving. Then at least send the ranger out, she insisted. He's not equipped for this level of engagement. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my response. I should have agreed with her, should have jumped at the chance to leave this increasingly dangerous situation, but something held me back. A compulsion I couldn't explain. I'm staying, I heard myself say. Whatever is happening, I'm part of it now. I need to see it through. Lawrence nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his expression. Very well. We'll establish a forward observation post near the threshold tomorrow. If the pattern holds, we should be able to document whatever occurs tomorrow night. The briefing concluded, and the team dispersed to their assigned tasks. I stepped outside, needing fresh air and space to process the surreal turn my assignment had taken. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lake, the water still and black beneath a deepening purple sky. Movement at the forest's edge caught my eye. A dark figure, taller than any human, standing partially concealed among the trees. It made no attempt to hide, watching me with an intelligence I could feel even at this distance. Strangely, I felt no fear, only a profound curiosity that mirrored what I imagined the creature must feel toward me. For a long moment, we observed each other across the clearing, neither making any move to approach or retreat. Then it raised one massive arm, pointing deliberately toward the northern basin before melting back into the forest. An invitation? A warning? Perhaps both. Either way, I knew with certainty that the answers I sought lay across the dark waters, at the place Lawrence had called the threshold. Whatever was going to happen there tomorrow night, I was meant to witness it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first frost of the season coating the grass and dock with a crystalline sheen that glittered in the early light. The lake was preternaturally still, like black glass reflecting the surrounding mountains with perfect clarity. Final preparations proceeded with military precision. The security team established a defensive position on a ridge overlooking the threshold, while the research team assembled their monitoring equipment in waterproof cases for transport across the lake. Lawrence assigned me to Bennett's boat, a small craft equipped with specialized sonar and underwater cameras. As we loaded the last of the gear, he pulled me aside one final time. Whatever happens tonight, stay close to the security team, he instructed. The NHIs have shown specific interest in you, which makes you both valuable to our observation and potentially vulnerable. You still haven't told me why they've focused on me, I noted. Lawrence's expression was unreadable. Some questions can only be answered through direct experience, Ranger. I believe you'll understand soon enough. With those cryptic words, he joined Captain in the lead boat, and our small flotilla set out across the lake toward the northern basin. The journey was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts as we navigated through the narrow passage that separated the main lake from our destination. The threshold was even more imposing up close. Sheer cliffs rose directly from the water on three sides, creating a natural amphitheater around a small, crescent-shaped beach of black sand. The water here was impossibly clear despite its depth, revealing massive boulders on the lake bed arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns. We secured the boats along the narrow shore, and the security team immediately established a perimeter, setting up surveillance equipment aimed at both the surrounding cliffs and the water itself. The researchers assembled their instruments, Chen directing the placement of sensors along the waterline, while Reyes established a communications relay with the cabin. I found myself drawn to the center of the crescent beach, where a flat stone the size of a small table emerged from the sand. Its surface was covered with weathered carvings, the same three-line symbol we'd found at the cabin, but elaborated into complex interlocking patterns that radiated outward from a central point. An altar of sorts, Lawrence said, appearing beside me. We've carbon-dated organic material from the cracks to approximately 12,000 years ago. These symbols predate all known human settlements in the region. You're suggesting these creatures have been here that long? Perhaps longer. The archaeological record is incomplete, but we've found similar markings in cave systems throughout the Pacific Northwest, always near water sources and always oriented towards specific celestial alignments. He glanced at his watch. We have several hours before sunset. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the area, but stay within visual range of the security team at all times. I spent the afternoon observing the researchers at work, occasionally assisting but mostly trying to make sense of my role and whatever was unfolding. The security team remained vigilant, though no signs of the creatures had been detected since our arrival. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a thin mist formed across the water's surface, clinging to the lake in defiance of the light breeze. It's starting, Chen announced, checking his instruments. Electromagnetic fluctuations increasing, just as predicted. The mist thickened as darkness fell, transforming the threshold into a realm of shadows and indistinct forms. Lights were kept to a minimum, red filters on all flashlights to preserve night vision and reduce their visibility from a distance. The security team activated night vision equipment, their quiet reports confirming what we already sensed. We were being surrounded. Heat signatures appeared along the cliff tops, massive forms moving with deliberate stealth to positions overlooking our encampment. At least 12 individuals, Captain reported, her voice tense but controlled. More than we've ever documented in one location. Lawrence nodded, excitement evident despite the potential danger. They're gathering for the event, just as we hypothesized. What event? I pressed, no longer willing to accept vague references. Before Lawrence could respond, a low, resonant sound echoed across the water. Not quite a howl, not quite a song, but something between the two. It was answered by another, then another, until the air vibrated with their calls, the acoustics of the enclosed basin amplifying and blending them into an otherworldly chorus. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous recordings, Chen noted, adjusting his equipment to capture the sounds, but the amplitude and coordination are unprecedented. The mist swirled and thickened, taking on a faint luminescence that cast everything in an ethereal blue glow. The water in the center of the basin began to move, gentle ripples at first, then more pronounced waves that radiated outward from a central point despite the absence of wind. Underwater activity, Bennett reported from her position at the sonar station. Multiple large objects ascending from depth. The security team tightened their formation around us, weapons ready but held low in a non-threatening posture. Captain's orders had been explicit. No offensive action unless directly attacked. The surface of the lake bulged upward, water cascading off a massive form as it rose from the depths. It wasn't one of the creatures, at least not as we'd seen them before. It was a structure of some kind, a megalithic arrangement of stones forming a rough archway that now broke the surface in the exact center of the basin. The gate, Lawrence whispered, awe overriding his scientific detachment. It's real. As the archway fully emerged, the vocalizations from the surrounding cliffs intensified, taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the structure. The mist condensed around the arch, flowing through it like water in reverse, creating a shimmering curtain within its confines. Electromagnetic readings off the scale, Chen reported, his instruments emitting warning tones. Quantum fluctuations consistent with theoretical models of space-time distortion. Whatever scientific explanation Chen was attempting, it failed to capture the sheer otherness of what we were witnessing. The arch had become a doorway of sorts, the space within it no longer showing the backdrop of cliffs and night sky, but rather a swirling void of colors and patterns that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. Movement along the shoreline drew our attention. Massive figures emerged from the forest and descended the cliffs, approaching the water's edge. In the ethereal light of the mist, I could see them clearly for the first time. 8 feet tall or more, powerfully built, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Their faces were almost human in structure, but with pronounced brow ridges, wide-set eyes that reflected the blue glow, and flattened noses above heavy jaws. They carried no weapons or tools, yet moved with a purpose and coordination that spoke of intelligence and social organization far beyond what any wild creature should possess. One of them, larger than the others and with silver streaking its dark fur, approached the water's edge directly across from our position. It locked eyes with me, recognition evident in its gaze. "It knows you," Lawrence murmured, watching the exchange. "The same one that's been observing the cabin, I suspect." The creature broke our eye contact, turning toward the arch in the center of the lake. It raised its arms and emitted a series of complex vocalizations that reverberated across the water. The others joined in, creating a harmonic convergence that seemed to stabilize and intensify the phenomenon within the archway. The security team shifted nervously, but Captain maintained control with hand signals, keeping them in a defensive posture. The researchers worked feverishly, documenting every aspect of the unfolding event. "Look," Bennett gasped, pointing toward the arch. Shapes were visible within the swirling portal, indistinct at first, then resolving into silhouettes that approximated the creatures on the shore, yet subtly different in proportion and movement. They seemed to be approaching from the other side, reaching the threshold but not crossing. The silver-streaked leader waded into the lake, moving with surprising grace through the chest-deep water toward the arch. When it reached the structure, it placed both massive hands on the stone pillars, throwing its head back in what appeared to be an expression of reverence or exultation. The portal flared brighter, the colors shifting rapidly. The shapes within it pressed closer, becoming more distinct with each passing moment. Hands, if they could be called that, reached out, nearly breaking the plane between worlds. "They're coming through," Lawrence stated, his scientific caution momentarily abandoned in the face of what we were witnessing. After all these years of observation, we're finally seeing a full manifestation, but something was wrong. The creature at the arch suddenly stiffened, its posture changing from reverence to alarm. It turned toward us, and even across the distance I could see fear in its 2 human eyes. It wasn't the security team that had triggered this reaction. It was something else, something beyond our perception but clearly visible to the creatures. The silverbacked leader bellowed a warning call, and chaos erupted. The creatures on shore retreated toward the forest, their movements no longer measured but urgent, almost panicked. The one by the arch remained, torn between escape and some responsibility to the portal it had helped create. "What's happening?" I demanded, turning to Lawrence. His face had gone pale. "Something's coming through. Something they didn't expect or want." The portal's color shifted to a deep, bloody red, the mist around it darkening and coiling like smoke. The water near the arch began to boil, steam rising in thick plumes that obscured our view. Captain made a decision. "All personnel, fall back to the boats. Prepare for immediate evacuation." The security team began a controlled withdrawal, covering the researchers as they hastily packed essential equipment. But I remained transfixed by the scene unfolding on the lake. The creature at the arch was struggling now, trying to close the portal by pushing the stone pillars together. But whatever force had been awakened was too strong. The archway held firm, and the red glow intensified, casting the creature's desperate efforts in a hellish light. It turned toward me once more, and in that moment I understood. The connection I'd felt, the reason for its interest in me. We were alike in some fundamental way, both guardians of a sort, both caught between worlds we barely understood. Without conscious decision, I found myself moving forward, wading into the cold water of Lake Wanana. Behind me, Lawrence shouted warnings, and Captain ordered her team to retrieve me, but they seemed distant, irrelevant. The creature and I approached the arch from opposite sides, meeting at the threshold between worlds. Up close, I could see intelligence and emotion in its eyes. Fear, yes, but also determination and something akin to recognition. It vocalized. Not the threatening growls from the cabin, but something softer, almost pleading. Though I couldn't understand the specific meaning, the intent was clear. "Help me close it." The portal pulsed, the redness deepening as something massive and formless pressed against the barrier between worlds, seeking entry. The water around the arch churned and steamed, the temperature rising to near boiling despite the night's chill. I placed my hands on the stone pillar opposite the creature, feeling an electric tingle run up my arms. The creature mirrored my position, our eyes meeting across the threshold as we both pushed against the ancient stones. Then, as if responding to our combined will, the archway began to move. The stone pillars grudgingly shifted, narrowing the opening. The entity on the other side redoubled its efforts, a high-pitched keening cutting through the night as it realized its opportunity was fading. With one final desperate surge of strength, the creature and I pushed the pillars together, sealing the doorway between worlds. The red light flashed blindingly bright, then vanished entirely, plunging the basin into darkness, broken only by the flashlights of the security team converging on our position. The pressure wave knocked me backward, sending me underwater momentarily. When I surfaced, gasping for breath, the arch was gone, sunk back beneath the lake's surface, leaving only gentle ripples to mark where it had been. On the opposite shore, the creature regarded me for a long moment, its expression unreadable in the sudden darkness. Then it raised one hand in what seemed like a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, before turning and disappearing into the forest with the others. The security team reached me, half dragging me back to shore where Lawrence waited, his expression a mixture of concern and scientific fascination. "What did you do?" he demanded as Captain's medic checked me for injuries. "What happened out there?" I struggled to find words that could encapsulate the experience. "We closed it," I finally said. Whatever was trying to come through, it wasn't welcome, not by them, not by us. So we closed the door. Lawrence studied me intently. "You're saying you cooperated with the NHI? Communicated somehow?" "Guardians," he repeated, testing the word. "That would explain much of their territorial behavior. Their aversion to human encroachment," Captain interrupted. "All business despite the extraordinary events we'd witnessed. The perimeter team reports all NHI signatures retreating. Whatever was happening appears to be over. We should evacuate while we have the opportunity." As the team prepared for departure, I stood at the water's edge, gazing out at the now peaceful lake. The mist had dissipated, revealing a sky brilliant with stars. Lake Wanana had reclaimed its secrets, at least for now. But I knew they would return, the creatures, the researchers, perhaps even the entity from beyond the threshold. This ancient place would continue to draw those who sought answers to mysteries beyond human understanding. And as our boat sliced through the dark waters toward the cabin, I realized my path had been irrevocably altered. I could never return to my former life, to routine ranger duties and mundane wilderness management. I had glimpsed something profound at the boundary between worlds, formed a connection with an intelligence not of human origin, whether I wanted it or not. I had become part of the Shadowwater's endless story, a new guardian at the threshold between worlds. The lake kept its secrets close, revealed them only to those who listened with more than their ears, watched with more than their eyes. I would listen, I would watch, and when the time came again, I would stand ready at the threshold of Wanana, for the shadows always return with the setting sun, and what sleeps beneath the waters will eventually awaken once more. The morning mist clung to the surface of Lake Wanasabi like a shroud, obscuring the dark waters that stretched nearly 3 miles across the valley floor. From my cabin's porch, I could just make out the hulking silhouettes of ancient pines that ringed the opposite shore. My 4th season as a ranger at Wanasabi Wilderness Area was just beginning, and already I felt the familiar mix of reverence and isolation that came with this posting. "Ranger Matthews, come in." The radio on my hip crackled to life, startling a nearby crow that had been eyeing my breakfast. "Matthews here," I responded, setting down my coffee mug on the weathered railing. "Got a situation. Hikers reported strange sounds near Obsidian Ridge last night. One camper hasn't returned to their group. Possible lost hiker. Can you check it out?" "Copy that. Heading there now." I gathered my gear methodically. First aid kit, topographic maps, GPS unit, extra water, emergency rations, flares, and my sidearm. Standard procedure for search operations, though firearm use was exceedingly rare, mostly for aggressive wildlife, black bears or mountain lions that occasionally threatened visitors, or so I had always believed. The drive to Obsidian Ridge trailhead took nearly an hour on unpaved Forest Service roads. The Wanasabi Wilderness stretched across 500,000 acres of the most remote forest land in the Pacific Northwest. Some areas hadn't seen human footprints in decades. Native legends claimed the forest harbored ancient spirits, guardians who protected the land from intrusion. The local tribes had named it Wanasabi, Place of Shadows. At the trailhead, I met the hiking group, 3 college students, wide-eyed and jittery. Their friend, a guy named Alex, had wandered off during the night to take pictures of the stars and never returned. "We heard noises," one of them said. A tall, thin guy who couldn't stop fidgeting with his backpack straps. "Not an animal. At least, not like any animal I've ever heard." "What did it sound like?" I asked, pulling out my notebook. The young woman in the group hugged herself against the morning chill. "Like wood breaking, but rhythmic, and then this low sound, almost like moaning but deeper. Much deeper than a human voice could go." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "How long has Alex been missing?" "About 6 hours now," the third hiker replied. "We tried calling for him, but..." He trailed off, glancing nervously at the dense forest. "You did the right thing by reporting it," I assured them. "I'll find your friend. Wait at the ranger station down the road. Someone will drive you back to the visitor center." After they left, I studied the topographic map. Obsidian Ridge was steep terrain with numerous ravines where someone could fall and become injured. Simple explanation. But something about their description of the sounds nagged at me. The trail soon narrowed, climbing steadily through old-growth forest. Massive trees blocked most of the morning sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. I called out periodically, my voice swallowed by the dense vegetation. "Alex! Ranger Service! Can you hear me?" 3 hours into the search, I found the first sign of disturbance, a clearing where the undergrowth had been flattened in a circular pattern about 15 feet in diameter. In the center lay a backpack, its contents scattered, a camera with a cracked lens, energy bar wrappers, a water bottle. I photographed everything before examining the ground more closely. The soil was soft from recent rain, and the impressions were unmistakable, footprints but not from hiking boots. These were enormous, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. They were deep, suggesting tremendous weight. My pulse quickened as I followed the prints to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into thicker forest. That's when I noticed the smell, a powerful musky odor unlike anything I had encountered before. Not bear, not elk. Something else entirely. I radioed back to headquarters. Matthews reporting. Found missing hikers' belongings at coordinates 45.28-121.79. Proceeding to search immediate vicinity. Requesting backup. Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing. The dense terrain often created dead zones for radio communication, but I'd never had problems in this area before. The light was already beginning to fade when I found the tree. An enormous pine, at least 6 feet in diameter, snapped clean through about 10 feet from the ground. Not cut. Broken, with jagged splinters protruding from both sections. The top portion lay across the trail, needles still green. This was recent. No storm could have done this. No natural force short of a tornado could snap a healthy tree of this size. As I stood examining the destruction, the forest fell completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, the wood-breaking sound the hikers had described. Crack, pause, crack. Rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. I switched off my flashlight instinctively, crouching beside the fallen tree. Crack. Closer now. Something large was moving through the forest, breaking branches as it came. My hand moved to my sidearm, though I knew it would be woefully inadequate against anything powerful enough to snap trees. A low rumble vibrated through the ground. Not quite a growl, deeper than any bear could produce. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating in my chest cavity. I'd spent my entire adult life in wilderness areas, encountered everything from grizzlies to wolf packs, but nothing had ever filled me with such primal dread. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a decision that went against all my training. I retreated, moving as quietly as possible back down the trail. Whatever was out there, I wasn't equipped to handle it alone in the dark. Alex would have to survive the night. I hoped he'd found shelter. The hike back to my vehicle seemed interminable, each shadow between the trees taking on menacing proportions. Several times I paused, certain I heard heavy footsteps paralleling my course through the woods, but I saw nothing, even when sweeping my flashlight across the undergrowth. Back at my cabin, I radioed in my findings, careful to stick to the facts without interpretation. Missing hiker, signs of struggle, unusual damage to vegetation. I didn't mention the footprints, didn't mention the smell. Some things you have to see to believe, and I wasn't ready to be the ranger who cried Bigfoot. As I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My cabin sat on a small clearing overlooking the lake, windows facing the water and the forest beyond. I double-checked the locks, something I rarely bothered with in this remote location. Just as I was about to turn off the light, something caught my eye through the window. A shadow, darker than the night, moving at the forest edge. Too large to be human, too upright to be a bear. For just a moment it seemed to turn toward the cabin, and I glimpsed what might have been eyes reflecting the distant moonlight. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness between the ancient trees of Wanasabi. Sleep did not come easily that night. Dawn broke with a heavy mist hanging over Lake Wanasabi, obscuring the far shore entirely. I'd spent a restless night reviewing what I'd seen, trying to rationalize my experience into something that fit my understanding of the world. Perhaps Alex had encountered a bear, explaining the destruction and his disappearance. Perhaps the footprints were actually overlapping tracks from multiple animals. Perhaps the stress of the search had affected my perception. But deep down, I knew better. I was brewing coffee when my radio crackled to life. "Matthews, do you copy? Search team is assembled at headquarters. ETA to your location 30 minutes. "Copy that," I responded, relieved that reinforcements were coming. "I'll meet you at the Obsidian Ridge trailhead." The drive back to the ridge felt different in daylight, though no less ominous. I parked at the trailhead and waited, scanning the forest edge. In the light of day, I questioned my decision to leave the search area the previous evening. It went against every protocol, but some primal instinct had overridden my training. The search team arrived. 2 other rangers and a local search and rescue volunteer with a tracking dog, a German shepherd named Rex. I briefed them on what I'd found, still omitting my more unusual observations. "Let's split into 2 teams, suggested Ranger Rivera, the most experienced among us. "Matthews and I will return to the last known location with Rex. Roberts and Johnson take the eastern ravine in case he fell." We hiked back to the clearing where I'd found the backpack. Rex became agitated almost immediately, whining and circling rather than tracking a scent trail. "What's wrong with him?" I asked the handler. "Never seen him act like this," the man responded, frowning. "It's like there's too many conflicting scents, or something's masking the trail." Rivera knelt to examine the ground, then looked up at me sharply. "What are these tracks, Matthews? You didn't mention footprints this size in your report." I hesitated. I wasn't sure what to make of them. She traced the outline of one print with her finger. "These are unusual. They continue into the forest," I said, pointing toward where I found the broken tree. Rivera stood, her expression unreadable. "Show me." We proceeded deeper into the forest, Rex still behaving erratically, until we reached the snapped pine. In daylight, the damage was even more impressive and concerning. The break wasn't weather-smooth but jagged, as if the massive trunk had been twisted until it gave way. "What could do this?" Rivera whispered, running her hand over the splintered wood. Before I could answer, our radios crackled with Robert's voice. "We found something. Eastern ravine, about half a mile from the ridge. You'd better come see this." We found Roberts and Johnson standing beside a small stream, looking grim. On the muddy bank lay a single hiking boot, Alex's, presumably, and scattered pieces of torn clothing. Blood darkened the rocks nearby. "No sign of him?" Rivera asked. Roberts shook his head. "Just this. But look at the trees." He pointed across the stream. 3 pines, each at least 100 years old, had been snapped at various heights. Beyond them, a path of destruction led deeper into the forest. Broken undergrowth, uprooted saplings, disturbed earth. "It's like something dragged him through here," Johnson said quietly. "Something big." Rivera turned to me. "Those tracks you found, did they lead in this direction?" I nodded slowly. The implications hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all of us. Whatever had taken Alex wasn't a conventional predator. "We need more people," Rivera decided, "and better equipment." "Should we follow the trail?" Roberts asked, clearly reluctant. Rivera hesitated, then shook her head. "Not without backup. This is beyond our usual search parameters." As we debated our next move, Rex suddenly growled, a deep, threatening sound I'd never heard from a search dog. His hackles rose as he stared into the forest beyond the stream. "What is it, boy?" the handler murmured, tightening his grip on the leash. A branch snapped in the distance, then another, closer. The rhythmic cracking I'd heard the night before returned, moving parallel to our position. "Everyone back to the trail," Rivera ordered quietly. Now, we retreated, moving as quickly as we could while maintaining silence. Rex continued to growl softly, his eyes fixed on the forest to our right, where something large seemed to be keeping pace with us, just out of sight. The 5-minute walk back to the main trail felt like hours. Once there, Rivera made a call on her satellite phone, requesting immediate assistance from state authorities. Her voice remained professional, but I could hear the underlying tension as she described finding evidence of predator activity and unusual environmental damage. Back at headquarters, we gathered around a topographic map, marking the areas we'd searched and the location of our findings. The other teams had returned empty-handed. "Whatever we're dealing with," Rivera said after the briefing, "it's not in our standard playbook." That evening, state wildlife officials arrived, along with 2 men in unmarked SUVs who identified themselves only as specialists from a federal resource management agency. They interviewed each of us separately, paying particular attention to my account since I'd been first on scene. One of the specialists, a gray-haired man with weathered features, showed unusual interest in my description of the footprints and the strange sounds. "You've worked wilderness areas for how long?" he asked. 7 years, I replied. 4 here at Wanasabi. Ever seen anything like this before? I shook my head. "But you've heard the stories, I assume, about what supposedly lives in these forests." I met his gaze evenly. "Every wilderness area has its legends. I deal in facts." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "We'll take over the search from here. Your team has been reassigned to visitor management. Keep people out of the northern quadrant until further notice." "What about Alex?" I pressed. "His friends deserve answers." "We'll handle it," he said firmly. "Official statement is that it was a bear attack. Tragic, but not uncommon." "That wasn't a bear," I said before I could stop myself. The specialist leaned forward. "No," he agreed quietly. "It wasn't, but bear attack is what goes in the report. Understood?" I understood then that I'd stumbled into something larger than a missing hiker case, something the authorities preferred to keep classified. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. That night I returned to my cabin, now accompanied by an uneasy awareness that Wanasabi held secrets I was only beginning to glimpse. As darkness fell, I stood on my porch listening to the forest sounds with new attentiveness. From across the lake came a long, mournful howl. Not a wolf, not a coyote, but something that raised goosebumps on my arms. It echoed across the water, seeming to penetrate the walls of my cabin and vibrate in my chest. I knew then that I couldn't simply walk away from this mystery, regardless of official directives. Alex was still out there, or what remained of him, and whatever had taken him was still hunting in my forest. The specialists might have their agenda, but I had responsibilities of my own. As I prepared for bed, I began making mental notes of the equipment I would need for my own investigation. Tomorrow I decided I would return to Obsidian Ridge alone, this time prepared for whatever awaited me in the ancient shadows of Wanasabi. Morning brought a heavy downpour that drummed against the cabin roof, matching my somber mood. The rain would wash away tracks, scents, and any remaining evidence, convenient for those who wanted this incident buried, inconvenient for my unsanctioned investigation. I called headquarters to report that I was taking a personal day, claiming a migraine. Rivera didn't sound convinced but didn't press the issue. The specialists had established a command post at the visitor center, effectively taking over operations. Most of the regular staff had been reassigned to the southern sections of the park. Once the call ended, I gathered my gear with careful deliberation. This wasn't a standard search and rescue mission anymore. This was something else entirely. I packed heavier provisions, emergency shelter, a more robust first aid kit, and my personal hunting knife. I hesitated before adding my off-duty sidearm, a .44 Magnum revolver with stopping power that far exceeded my service weapon. Against my better judgment, I included a small digital recorder. If I was going to violate protocols, I might as well document my findings. The drive to Obsidian Ridge was treacherous in the downpour, mud sliding beneath my tires as I navigated the service road. I parked half a mile from the official trailhead, concealing my vehicle behind a stand of young hemlocks. The last thing I needed was for the specialist to discover my presence. The rain had reduced visibility to about 50 yards, transforming the forest into a gray labyrinth of dripping vegetation. I orientated myself using my GPS unit and set off toward the ravine where we'd found Alex's boot. The going was slow and miserable. Waterlogged ground turned the trail into a muddy creek, and twice I nearly lost my footing on slick rocks. But the weather provided one advantage. The drumming rain masked any sounds I might make, potentially allowing me to move undetected. By midday, I reached the stream where we'd made our grim discovery. The area had been altered. Someone had removed the boot and clothing fragments, and I noticed small flags marking various points of interest. The specialists had been thorough. I followed the path of destruction we'd observed the previous day, moving cautiously through the damaged undergrowth. The trail led northward, deeper into the wilderness area, away from established hiking routes. After about a mile, I noticed the forest beginning to change. The trees here were older, massive trunks stretching toward a canopy that blocked much of the rain. Moss hung in thick curtains, and the undergrowth thinned, suggesting fewer disturbances over time. The trail of broken vegetation ended abruptly at the base of a sheer cliff face that rose nearly 100 feet. Water cascaded down its surface in dozens of small waterfalls created by the rain. I consulted my map, confirming what I already suspected. I had reached the edge of what rangers informally called the Quiet Zone, a section of the wilderness that remained largely unexplored due to its rugged terrain and lack of established trails. I scanned the cliff base, looking for any sign of where the trail might continue. About 50 yards to my right, a dark opening appeared in the rock face, the entrance to what appeared to be a cave. Approaching cautiously, I detected that same musky odor I'd noticed earlier, now stronger despite the rain. The cave mouth was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, with worn smooth edges suggesting long use. Fresh scratches marked the stone around the entrance. I switched on my flashlight and stepped just inside the opening, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The cave extended back into the cliff, widening as it went. The floor was surprisingly level and clear of debris, as if it had been deliberately maintained. Something crunched under my boot. I directed my light downward and immediately stepped back. Bones, dozens of them, lay scattered near the walls of the cave. Most appeared to be from deer or elk, but some were unmistakably human. A skull, partially crushed, rested against the cave wall, empty eye sockets staring accusingly at the intruder who had disturbed its rest. My hand moved to my sidearm instinctively. I should leave, report this location to the authorities, regardless of their agenda, but something compelled me forward, a need to understand what was happening in my forest. The cave extended about 30 feet before opening into a larger chamber, and there, illuminated by a shaft of gray daylight from some opening in the ceiling, lay a scene that defied rational explanation. A crude structure occupied the center of the chamber, a shelter built from woven branches and what appeared to be animal hides. Surrounding it were artifacts that spoke of primitive intelligence, tools fashioned from bone and stone, containers made from hollowed wood, and most disturbingly, items of obvious human origin. A wristwatch, a boot that matched the one we'd found, tattered clothing arranged in what almost appeared to be a deliberate display. I activated my recorder, whispering descriptions of what I was seeing, knowing how incredible it would sound. This wasn't the random collection of a scavenging animal. This was a dwelling. As I documented the scene, I became aware of a rhythmic sound echoing through the cave. Not the cracking of wood this time, but a slow dripping from the ceiling. The chamber had fallen unnaturally silent otherwise, the usual subterranean sounds of water and shifting stone absent. Then I realized the dripping had pattern. It was too regular, too measured. I turned slowly, directing my light toward the sound. In the darkest corner of the chamber, partially concealed by a natural column of stone, something moved, something massive, something watching. I caught only glimpses as it shifted position. Matted hair covering enormous limbs, a sloped shoulder that brushed the ceiling nearly 9 feet above the floor, eyes that reflected my light with an amber glow that spoke of intelligence and primal anger. My light beam caught a flash of pale color clutched in what might have been a hand, a scrap of fabric that I recognized with horrified certainty as the shirt Alex had been wearing in the photos his friends had shown me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we regarded each other across the cave. Ranger and legend, human and something that defied classification. I felt a pressure building in my skull, a sensation that transcended ordinary fear and approached some deeper, genetic memory of being prey. Then it moved. What followed exists in my memory as fragmented impressions rather than a coherent sequence. The creature, for I have no better word, lunged not toward me but deeper into the cave system, moving with shocking speed for its size. I caught impressions of massive limbs, a head that seemed to sit directly on sloped shoulders, and that overwhelming musky scent. I retreated, nearly falling in my haste to reach the cave entrance. Outside, the rain had intensified, reducing visibility to mere yards. I ran blindly, abandoning the careful tracking that had brought me here, focused only on putting distance between myself and the cave. How long I ran, I cannot say. Eventually, physical exhaustion forced me to stop, collapsing against the trunk of an enormous cedar. My lungs burned, and my legs trembled with fatigue and residual terror. I had dropped my pack somewhere in the flight, retaining only my sidearm and the recorder clutched in a white-knuckled grip. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of my surroundings once more. The forest had changed again. The trees here were arranged in an almost circular pattern around a small clearing. At the center stood a weathered stone structure roughly 4 feet high, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. An altar of some kind, perhaps, or a boundary marker from some forgotten era. I approached it cautiously, running my fingers over the worn carvings. Among them, one stood out with disturbing clarity. A crude but recognizable depiction of a figure, massive and hunched, with long arms and a suggestion of thick hair covering its body. The stone felt warm beneath my touch despite the cool rain, as if it retained some inner heat. And as I examined the carvings more closely, I realized some of them weren't ancient at all. Fresh marks had been added recently, the exposed stone lighter than the weathered surface around it. Someone, or something, was maintaining this marker, communicating through it perhaps, in a language I couldn't begin to comprehend. The realization that I was standing in what might be a ritual site used by the creature from the cave spurred me back into motion. I needed to return to civilization to process what I had seen and decide what to do with the knowledge. The rain finally ceased as evening approached, and I managed to orient myself using landmarks and my compass. I had lost my GPS unit along with my pack, but years of wilderness experience guided me back toward the ranger station. Night was falling as I emerged from the forest near the service road, about 2 miles from where I had parked. As I trudged along the muddy track, headlights appeared around a bend. An unmarked SUV identical to those the specialists had arrived in. I stepped off the road, concealing myself behind a fallen log. The vehicle slowed as it approached, spotlights mounted on its roof sweeping the forest edge. They were searching for something, or someone. The SUV passed without stopping, but its presence confirmed my suspicions. The authorities knew more than they were admitting about what lived in Wanasabi. This wasn't a new discovery, but an ongoing situation they were monitoring and concealing from the public. I waited until the vehicle disappeared around the next bend before continuing, now moving through the forest parallel to the road rather than on it. By the time I reached my hidden vehicle, full darkness had fallen, and a new sound echoed through the forest, the distinctive whump-whump of helicopter rotors, somewhere to the north. Whatever I had stirred up with my intrusion had prompted a significant response. As I drove carefully back toward my cabin, I replayed the recorder, half expecting to find it empty, some cruel trick of an overwrought imagination. But there it was, my breathless narration of the cave's contents, followed by a sound that made me nearly drive off the road, a deep, rumbling vocalization that had not registered in my conscious memory during the encounter. A language, perhaps, or a warning. Evidence, at minimum, that what I had seen was real. Back at my cabin, I secured the doors and windows, though I harbored no illusions that such measures would stop the creature if it decided to come for me. I transferred the recording to my laptop and wrote detailed notes of everything I had observed, from the cave dwelling to the stone marker in the forest. As I worked, a new conviction formed in my mind. The specialists weren't just covering up the existence of an unclassified species, they were protecting it. The question was why, and what connection it might have to the ancient tribes who had named this wilderness the Place of Shadows. Tomorrow, I decided, I would seek answers from the only source likely to speak truthfully, the tribal elders whose ancestors had lived alongside whatever stalked the forests of Wanasabi long before rangers and specialists arrived to manage the wilderness. The Tribal Cultural Center sat at the edge of the reservation, about 40 miles from Wanasabi's main entrance. I arrived shortly after it opened, having called in sick for the second consecutive day. My phone had been buzzing with messages from Rivera and, more concerning, from the specialists, but I had ignored them all. The center was quiet, just a few visitors examining displays of traditional crafts and historical photographs. I approached an elderly woman arranging pamphlets at the information desk, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, turquoise jewelry adorning her wrists and neck. "I need to speak with someone about Wanasabi," I said quietly, showing my ranger badge. "About its history and legends." She studied me for a long moment, her dark eyes revealing nothing. "Why does a park ranger need to know old stories?" she asked finally. "I've seen something," I admitted. "Something I can't explain." She nodded slowly as if my words confirmed a suspicion. "Wait here." She disappeared through a door marked staff only, returning minutes later. "Come," she said simply, holding the door open. She led me to a small conference room where an elderly man sat at a table, his weathered hands resting on a carved wooden cane. He nodded at the chair across from him. "This is Bernard Whitefeather," the woman said, "tribal historian. If anyone can answer your questions, it's him." She left, closing the door behind her. "You've seen the Guardian," Whitefeather said without preamble, his voice surprisingly strong despite his apparent age. I hesitated, then nodded. "In a cave near the northern cliff face. It had collected things. Human things. And now the government men are scrambling, he said with a hint of satisfaction. They think they can control everything with their protocols and classifications. What is it? I asked. Some undiscovered species? Whitefeather tapped his cane against the floor. Not undiscovered. Known to my people since before Europeans came to these lands. We called them Saquon, the elder brothers. They were here first, and they will remain when humans have gone. It killed a hiker, I said. Took him to its cave. Perhaps, Whitefeather conceded. Or perhaps the hiker violated boundaries he should not have crossed. The Saquon are territorial, and they understand more than you might think. They watch, they learn, they remember. The specialists know about them, I said. They're covering it up, of course. They've known since the 1970s when they first established a research station within the wilderness area. They study the Saquon from a distance, document their movements, occasionally retrieve their dead when one dies. All very scientific. He spoke the last word with undisguised contempt. Why keep it secret? This would be the zoological discovery of the century. Whitefeather laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves rustling. Can you imagine what would happen if the world learned that creatures from mankind's darkest folklore actually exist? That something stronger, older, and possibly smarter than humans has been living alongside us, watching us. The specialists understand what my people have always known. Some truths are better left in shadow. How many are there? I asked, trying to process his words. No one knows exactly. They migrate through vast territories, following ancient paths, but Wanasabi has always been special to them. Sacred, you might say. The stone markers you saw in the forest, they were placed there centuries ago, a boundary agreement between my ancestors and the Saquon. I stared at him. How did you know about the stone markers? He smiled slightly. Because I was taken to see them as a child, just as my grandfather was, and his grandfather before him. Some of us are chosen to remember, to maintain the old ways, to respect the boundaries. The authorities don't respect those boundaries, I pointed out. They've built roads, visitor centers, hiking trails, and notice how many accidents occur each year in certain areas. Notice which sections of the wilderness remain closed due to unstable terrain or sensitive habitat. The specialists may use different words, but the result is the same. Keeping humans away from Saquon territory. I thought about the northern quadrant, perpetually restricted for various bureaucratic reasons that changed each season. It made a disturbing kind of sense. What should I do with what I know? I asked finally. Whitefeather studied me. You have seen what few outsiders ever see and lived to speak of it. The Saquon could have taken you in that cave, but it did not. That suggests you might have a role to play. What role? My people have always had those who walked between worlds, human and spirit, civilization and wilderness. Perhaps you are such a bridge. Before I could press him further, the door opened. The woman from the information desk entered, her expression grave. There are men looking for him, she said to Whitefeather, nodding toward me. Government types. 2 vehicles in the parking lot. I stood quickly. Is there another way out? Whitefeather pointed his cane toward a side door. Through the cultural archives, then the loading dock. My granddaughter will show you. As I moved to follow her, he caught my arm. The Saquon respect courage and honesty. If you return to the forest, go openly. Take no weapons. Bring an offering, food left at the stone marker. Speak aloud your intentions. Will it understand? Better than you might think, he replied. They've been watching us for thousands of years. Some say they can even take things from our minds without words. The woman, Whitefeather's granddaughter, apparently led me through a room filled with artifacts in glass cases, then down a hallway to a metal door that opened onto a small loading area behind the building. My car's out front, I said, realizing I was effectively trapped. Take mine, she offered, handing me a set of keys. The blue truck in the corner. I'll retrieve yours later. As I took the keys, she added, my grandfather doesn't suggest offerings lightly. If you go back, follow his advice exactly. The Saquon don't give second chances. I thanked her and slipped out, making my way to an aged blue pickup. As I pulled away from the cultural center, I glimpsed 2 men in dark suits entering the main entrance. The specialists had tracked me down faster than I'd anticipated. I took back roads toward Wanasabi, my mind racing through everything Whitefeather had told me. If he was right, if the Saquon were an intelligent species that had coexisted with humans for millennia, then the implications were staggering. But one question remained paramount. What had happened to Alex? Was he dead, a victim of territorial aggression? Or was there some other explanation for his disappearance? I needed to return to the forest, to the cave. But this time I would follow Whitefeather's advice and go without weapons, bearing an offering instead of threats. First, though, I needed supplies and a plan for evading the specialists who were clearly monitoring my movements. I drove to a small town about 30 miles from the wilderness area, where I purchased food items for the offering: fresh fruit, bread, and salted meat that would travel well. I also bought basic camping supplies to replace what I'd lost during my panicked flight from the cave. As evening approached, I drove toward a rarely used fire service road that provided back access to Wanasabi's northern section. The road was gated and locked, but as a ranger, I had keys to all the maintenance entrances. If the specialists were watching the main roads, this might allow me to slip in unobserved. The plan worked better than I'd hoped. I parked the borrowed truck in a maintenance shed about 2 miles from my cabin, then proceeded on foot through the gathering darkness. From a ridge overlooking the ranger station, I could see unusual activity: additional vehicles, portable equipment set up outside, and personnel moving with the disciplined precision of military rather than civilian authorities. Whatever I had stumbled upon had escalated significantly during my absence. I circled wide around the developed area, approaching my cabin from the lakeside, rather than the main path. Inside, I moved quickly, gathering essential supplies and checking my computer. As I'd suspected, someone had been there. Subtle signs of a search were evident in slightly misplaced items and a chair not pushed in completely. I downloaded my notes and the recording to a flash drive, then deleted the originals. As an afterthought, I left a false trail, a hastily written note suggesting I was heading to the nearest city to speak with a journalist friend. Supplies packed and offering secured, I slipped back into the forest. Night had fully fallen, but the nearly full moon provided enough light to navigate by. I would camp in the forest tonight and make my way to the stone marker at dawn. As I hiked, I felt a strange calm descend. Fear remained, certainly, but beneath it lay a growing sense of purpose. Whitefeather's words about being a bridge echoed in my mind. Perhaps there was a reason I had been drawn to this wilderness, to this particular ranger posting, years before. I made camp in a small hollow well off any established trail, not bothering with a fire that might attract attention. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at stars visible through gaps in the canopy, I whispered aloud my intentions: to understand, not to harm, to listen, not to judge. If the Saquon truly could take thoughts from human minds, as Whitefeather had suggested, then perhaps it already knew I was coming. Perhaps it was watching even now from the darkness between the trees. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself oddly comforted by the possibility that I was not truly alone in the vast wilderness. With that unsettling thought, I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of stone markers and amber eyes watching from shadows. I awoke before dawn to the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The search had intensified. I packed quickly and continued north, staying beneath the thick canopy where I would be invisible from the air. By mid-morning, I reached the circular clearing with the stone marker. In daylight, the site appeared even more deliberately arranged, the surrounding trees unnaturally uniform in their spacing. I approached the marker slowly, setting my pack aside and removing the offering I had brought. Following instinct as much as Whitefeather's instructions, I placed the food items at the base of the stone, arranging them with care rather than simply dumping them. Then I stood back, hands open at my sides, and spoke aloud to the seemingly empty forest. I am Ranger Matthews of Wanasabi Wilderness. I come seeking understanding, not conflict. I have seen your dwelling. I know you are watchers of this land, as I am in my own way. I ask to speak with you about the human who entered your territory. My words hung in the still air, feeling simultaneously foolish and profound. Nothing moved in the forest around me. No response came. I waited an hour, then two, sitting cross-legged near the marker but not so close as to appear threatening. The forest continued its normal activities. Birds called, small animals rustled in the undergrowth, insects buzzed in the warming air. Just as I was beginning to think Whitefeather had sent me on a fool's errand, I noticed the change. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. The forest was falling silent in a wave that approached from the north, as if something was moving through it, causing every living thing to pause in momentary respect or fear. I rose slowly to my feet, heart pounding but determined not to show fear. From the deepest shadows between ancient trunks, a figure emerged, massive, over 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick reddish-brown hair. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, each step deliberate and silent despite its weight. The Saquon had come to hear me, and now I had to find the courage to face it and speak of murder and territory, of boundaries and respect, with a creature straight from mankind's oldest nightmares. The Saquon halted at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadow of an enormous pine. Even at this distance, its presence was overwhelming, a palpable weight in the air, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. I fought the urge to retreat as it took another step forward, now fully visible in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. My first clear look at the creature challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It stood upright but with a slight forward stoop, massive shoulders hunched beneath a thick coat of auburn hair. Its face combined features that seemed both ape-like and disturbingly human. A prominent brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes, a wide nose with flaring nostrils, and a mouth that appeared capable of both bestial snarls and deliberate expressions. Those eyes amber with vertical pupils like a cat's, fixed on me with unmistakable intelligence. Not the simple curiosity of a bear or the predatory assessment of a mountain lion, but something that spoke of thought, of judgment, of memory. It tilted its head slightly, examining me as I examined it. Then it did something I never expected. It raised one massive hand, palm outward, in what could only be interpreted as a greeting, or perhaps a gesture of peace. Finding my voice, I raised my own hand in mirror response. "I come with respect," I said, the words emerging steadier than I felt. "I seek understanding about the human who entered your territory." The Saquon made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like the rumble of distant thunder. It pointed to the stone marker, then to itself, then swept its arm in a wide arc that encompassed the surrounding forest. The meaning seemed clear enough. "This is my territory, marked by the stone." "I understand," I responded. "But the human—" I hesitated, unsure how to communicate the concept of a missing person to a being that might not share human values regarding life. The creature moved closer, now just 20 feet away. I held my ground despite every instinct screaming at me to run. It pointed at me, then made a gesture like something small and quick moving through the forest. "Yes, humans come here," I acknowledged. "Visitors. But one is missing. Taken." I mimed someone being carried away. The Saquon watched my pantomime, then made a sound that startled me. A series of clicks and deep vocalizations that had structure, rhythm, patterns, language. It pointed to the offering I had left, then back toward the direction of its cave, making the carrying motion I had just demonstrated. Understanding dawned. "You took him to your cave," I said. "But why? Was he threatening you?" The creature approached the stone marker, moving with a grace incongruous with its bulk. It knelt before the carved surface, massive fingers tracing one of the symbols, a spiral pattern that I hadn't noticed before. Then it pointed toward the sky, making a circular motion. I struggled to interpret. Time? Cycles? Seasons? It repeated the gesture more emphatically, adding a new element, pointing to the spiral, then to its chest, then making a rocking motion with its arms. An impossible thought formed in my mind. "A child? You have a child?" The Saquon repeated the rocking gesture, then pointed again in the direction of its cave. "There's a young one in the cave," I said slowly, trying to process the implications. "And Alex, the human, did he threaten your child?" The creature bared its teeth briefly, not in aggression I sensed, but to communicate strong emotion. It picked up a stick and snapped it sharply, then pointed toward where a helicopter's distant thrumming could be heard. "He brought danger," I translated. "Attention from the outside." The Saquon nodded, an unmistakably human gesture that sent a shiver through me. It had been watching us, learning our movements, our expressions for who knew how long. "Is he alive?" I asked, the question that had haunted me since discovering the cave. The creature made a gesture I couldn't interpret, then pointed toward the north again, beyond the direction of its cave. "He's somewhere else? You moved him?" Another nod, followed by a series of gestures, pointing to its eyes, then to the forest, then a walking motion with its fingers. "You're watching him? Keeping him somewhere?" The Saquon made a sound that might have been affirmation, then pointed at me, at itself, and made a motion like two people walking side by side. The meaning hit me with stunning clarity. "You want me to go with you?" The creature extended its massive hand, palm up, an invitation impossible to misinterpret. Time seemed to freeze as I considered my options. I could refuse, retreat to the ranger station, report everything I had learned to the specialists. They clearly had protocols for these situations, containment procedures, perhaps even communication methods more sophisticated than my crude gestures. But I remembered Whitefeather's words about being a bridge between worlds, about the Saquon choosing who they revealed themselves to, about respect and courage. "I'll come with you," I said, stepping forward to accept whatever fate awaited. The creature turned and moved into the forest, glancing back to ensure I followed. Its pace was deliberate, accommodating my slower human movements. We traveled in silence through terrain that grew increasingly rugged and unfamiliar. After about 2 hours, we approached a ridgeline I didn't recognize from any of the park maps. The Saquon led me along its base to a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely visible behind a stand of young trees. It gestured for me to enter first, a test of trust I couldn't refuse at this point. I squeezed through the opening, finding myself in a narrow passage that quickly widened into a small cavern illuminated by patches of sunlight streaming through cracks in the ceiling. And there, sitting on a crude bed of grasses and what appeared to be torn sleeping bag material, was Alex. He looked up as I entered, eyes widening in shock. "Ranger Matthews?" he croaked, voice hoarse from disuse or screaming, I couldn't tell which. "Are you real?" "I'm real," I assured him, quickly scanning for injuries. Besides looking malnourished and disheveled, he appeared physically intact. "Are you hurt?" Before he could answer, the Saquon ducked through the entrance, its massive frame nearly filling the small cave. Alex shrank back against the wall, terror plain on his face. "It's okay," I said, though the words sounded absurd even to my own ears. I think it's been protecting you." "Protecting?" Alex laughed, a brittle sound on the edge of hysteria. "It dragged me through the forest, kept me prisoner. I thought it was saving me for food." The Saquon made a disgusted sound, startling us both. It moved to a corner of the cave where a collection of objects lay, including Alex's backpack. It rummaged through the pack, pulling out Alex's camera. With surprising delicacy for such massive hands, the creature turned the camera on and navigated to the stored images. It brought the device to me, pointing at the screen. The photo showed a small clearing different from the one with the stone marker. At its center was what appeared to be a nest made of branches and moss, and within it a smaller version of the Saquon, a juvenile, unmistakably. I showed the image to Alex. "You photographed its child," I said quietly. "Probably wandered into a nursery area." "I didn't know," he whispered. "I was just hiking, taking pictures of interesting things I found." The Saquon made another series of vocalizations, then pointed toward the cave entrance, then to Alex, then made a shooing motion. The meaning was clear enough. "It's letting you go," I translated. "Now that I'm here to, I don't know, vouch for you? Explain? Why didn't it just let me go before?" Alex demanded, still pressed against the wall. I thought about the helicopter sounds we'd heard, the specialists swarming the wilderness area. Because there are people searching who know about these creatures, people who might want to capture them, study them. It was hiding you until it could safely release you. The Saquon nodded again, that disconcertingly human gesture, and pointed at the camera, then made a braking motion with its hands. "It wants the photographs destroyed," I said. "All evidence." Alex nodded frantically. "Fine, whatever it wants. Just let me out of here." The creature stepped back from the entrance, clearing our path. I helped Alex to his feet. He was weak from his ordeal but able to walk. As we moved toward the exit, the Saquon caught my arm with a gentle but irresistible grip. It looked directly into my eyes, then pointed to the stone marker symbol traced in the dirt of the cave floor, then to itself, then made a gesture encompassing the entire forest. "I understand," I said. "This is your home, your territory. I'll make sure people respect that." It released me and made one final gesture, pointing to its eyes, then to mine, then making a circular motion that returned to the starting point. "Yes," I agreed, understanding its meaning with unexpected clarity. "I'll return someday." We left the cave, Alex leaning heavily on my shoulder. The Saquon did not follow but remained watching from the entrance, a silhouette against the darkness that seemed to embody the wilderness itself, ancient, powerful, and infinitely more complex than humanity had ever imagined. The journey back took nearly 5 hours, with Alex weakening as we progressed. I supported him as best I could, following game trails and landmarks to navigate back toward the ranger station. As we approached the edge of the developed area, I heard shouts and saw flashlight beams sweeping through the trees. The search parties were out in force. "We need a story," I told Alex quickly. "Something believable." He nodded, understanding immediately. "I got lost, fell, hit my head. You found me wandering, confused from a concussion. And the photos, the creature? Delirium," he said firmly. "Stress hallucinations, that's what I'll tell them." I squeezed his shoulder in gratitude. "Just one thing," I said as the searchlights drew nearer. "What did it feed you, in the cave?" Alex's expression shifted to something between wonder and confusion. "Berries," he said. "Fresh water. Once a fish. It watched to see what I would eat, then brought more of the same." Before I could respond, the search team broke through the tree line ahead. Rivera, Roberts, and 2 of the specialists. armed with more than standard ranger equipment. Matthews? Thank God, Rivera shouted, rushing forward. And is that, you found him? How? Questions later, I interrupted. He needs medical attention. Exposure, dehydration, possible concussion. The specialists exchanged glances, one of them speaking quietly into a radio. Within minutes, a medical evacuation team arrived, loading Alex onto a stretcher despite his protests that he could walk. As they carried him toward the waiting vehicle, one of the specialists pulled me aside. This conversation isn't over, Matthews, he said quietly. We'll need a full debriefing. Everything you saw, everything you did. I met his gaze steadily. Of course. But I think you already know what's out there. A flicker of something. Recognition, respect, warning, crossed his face. Then you understand the importance of discretion. More than you might think, I replied. Later, after the medical team had taken Alex away and the search parties had dispersed, I stood alone on my cabin porch, looking out over the dark surface of Lake Wanasabi. The forest beyond seemed different now. Not just wilderness to be managed, but territory to be respected. A realm where humanity was merely a recent visitor, rather than the dominant force. I knew the specialist would return with their questions, their protocols, their containment strategies. I knew Alex would eventually tell his story of getting lost and suffering hallucinations from exposure and fear. I knew life would continue at Wanasabi Wilderness Area with its carefully marked trails and ranger-guided nature walks. But I also knew that deep in the northern reaches beyond the stone markers with their ancient carvings, something watched and waited. Something that had been here long before humans claimed the land. Something that would remain long after our brief moment in the forest's history had passed. And somehow, for reasons I might never fully understand, it had chosen me to witness its existence, to become a bridge between worlds, to carry the knowledge that we were not alone in the wild places of the earth. As if in response to my thoughts, a call echoed across the lake. That distinctive, otherworldly howl I had heard before but now recognized not as a threat but as a declaration. A reminder of boundaries, of respect, of coexistence on nature's terms rather than humanity's. I raised my hand in acknowledgement, certain that somewhere in the darkness, amber eyes were watching. And I knew with absolute certainty that I would return to the stone marker when the time was right, to continue the conversation that had begun between ranger and legend, human and Saquon, in the ancient shadows of Wanasabi. The driving rain hammered the roof of my truck as I navigated the winding forest road toward Manitou Peak Wilderness Area. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and visibility had dropped to mere feet. My GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving me with nothing but a paper map and fading daylight. You wanted isolation, I muttered to myself as lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the dense wall of pines on either side of the narrow road. Well, congratulations, you got it. After 12 years working desk jobs at more tourist-friendly national parks, I'd requested a transfer to somewhere remote, somewhere I could escape the constant flow of visitors asking the same questions day after day, somewhere I could reconnect with why I'd become a ranger in the first place. Manitou Peak was that place, a sprawling wilderness area covering over 400,000 acres of virtually untouched forest in the Pacific Northwest. The assignment was straightforward. Maintain the Lone Ranger Station, patrol designated areas, and occasionally assist the rare backpacker who ventured this deep into the backcountry. The rain finally began to ease as I rounded a bend and spotted a weathered wooden sign, Manitou Peak Wilderness Area, authorized personnel only. Below it, someone had nailed a crudely painted board with the words "Turn Back" in faded red letters. Charming welcome, I said, turning onto the gravel access road. The ranger station appeared after another mile. A substantial log cabin perched on a small rise overlooking a placid lake. Despite the dreary weather, it looked picturesque, like something from a postcard. 2-story, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, a stone chimney, and solar panels on the southern exposure of the roof. I parked and grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat. The previous ranger, a man named Jenkins according to my paperwork, had left 2 weeks ago. The official report stated family emergency, but the regional supervisor had been evasive when I'd pressed for details during my briefing. Jenkins was affected by his time at Manitou, was all she would say. The isolation gets to some people. The cabin key worked smoothly, and I stepped inside, greeted by the musty smell of a place closed up too long. The interior was surprisingly spacious. A main room with a stone fireplace, small kitchen area, communications equipment on a desk in the corner, and a narrow staircase leading to what I assumed was a bedroom. Practical and functional, with few personal touches, except for the walls. Every available inch of wall space was covered with maps of the wilderness area, marked with red X's, circles, and cryptic notes. Between the maps hung dozens of blurry photographs, all seemingly taken at night or in heavy fog. In many, I could make out what appeared to be a large, dark shape at the edge of the frame. "What the hell, Jenkins?" I whispered, moving closer to examine one particularly disturbing photo. It showed what looked like a massive footprint in mud, easily twice the size of a human foot, with a measuring tape placed alongside for scale. A leather-bound journal sat on the desk beside the radio equipment. I flipped it open to find page after page of increasingly frantic handwriting. Day 47, third sighting. Taller than I thought. Not a bear. Not a bear. Day 61. Found another print. 18 inches. No known animal makes tracks this size. Day 89. It watches the cabin at night. I can feel it out there. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks earlier, contained only 5 words. "IT knows I'm alone here." A sudden thump against the porch made me jump. I whirled around, heart pounding, only to see a fallen branch sliding down the rain-slick boards outside the window. The radio crackled to life, startling me again. "Manitou Base, this is Regional. Radio check, over." A woman's voice, professional but tinged with something else. "Concern?" I picked up the handset. "Regional, this is Manitou Base. Reading you 5x5. Over. Good to hear you made it, Ranger. Weather system's moving in fast. You're looking at 3 days minimum of heavy rain and possible flooding in the lower elevations. Recommend you stay put until it passes." "Understood, Regional. I'll use the time to settle in." A pause, longer than necessary. Then, "Ranger, did Jenkins leave any unusual materials at the station?" I glanced at the wall of maps and photographs. "Define unusual." Another pause. "Disregard. Just stick to the established trails when you start patrols. Some areas around Manitou have dangerous terrain, sinkholes, rock slides. Jenkins went off trail too often." "Copy that," I replied, increasingly uneasy. "Regional out." The radio went silent, leaving me alone with the sound of rain on the roof and a growing sense that I was missing something important about this assignment. I spent the next hour unpacking and exploring the cabin more thoroughly. The upstairs held a bedroom and small bathroom with a shower that ran on collected rainwater. The maps continued upstairs, along with more photographs, these showing broken trees, twisted as if something massive had pushed through the forest. In the bedroom closet, I found a rifle case containing a high-powered hunting rifle that wasn't standard Ranger issue, along with several boxes of ammunition. Beneath it lay a motion-activated game camera and a stack of memory cards labeled by date. Night fell quickly, the darkness absolute in a way city dwellers never experience. I built a fire in the fireplace and heated a can of soup, trying to ignore the eyes of those blurry photographs watching me from every wall. As I finished eating, a long, low howl drifted across the lake. Not quite wolf, not quite anything I recognized. The sound raised goosebumps along my arms. The cabin's generator hummed steadily, powering the lights and radio equipment, but suddenly cut out with a sputtering cough, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the flickering firelight. In that moment of startled silence, I heard it. Heavy footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked under significant weight as something moved toward the door. I reached for my flashlight, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps stopped directly outside. Then came 3 distinct knocks on the door. I remained frozen, flashlight clutched in white-knuckled hands as the knocking came again. 3 slow, deliberate impacts that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's sturdy frame. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, moose, lost hiker? None felt right. "Hello?" I called, voice steadier than I expected. "Identify yourself," silence answered. Then the footsteps moved away, heavy and unhurried, circling toward the side of the cabin. A window rattled as if something had pressed against it. I grabbed the rifle from the case, loaded it with fumbling fingers, and approached the window cautiously. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness outside, illuminating nothing but rain and swaying pine branches. The generator kicked back on suddenly, lights flickering to life. I spent the remainder of that first night alternating between watching the windows and poring over Jenkins' journal, each entry more disturbing than the last. Day 112. Found hiker's backpack torn to shreds 2 miles south of Blackwater Creek. No sign of owner. Day 134. It mimics sounds. Today it was crying like a child. Almost followed it into the thicket before I realized. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Despite Regional's warning about the weather, the storm had passed. leaving behind a pristine wilderness washed clean by rain. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and surveyed my new domain. The lake stretched before me, mirror smooth and reflecting the snow-capped peak of Manitou Mountain. Dense forest surrounded the clearing where the cabin stood, a sea of green punctuated by the occasional splash of yellow as aspens began their autumn transformation. It was breathtaking and utterly silent. No bird song, no chittering squirrels, no buzzing insects. The absence of sound was profound and deeply unsettling. I decided to conduct a perimeter check of the immediate area, service weapon holstered at my hip and Jenkins' rifle slung across my back. The ground around the cabin told a story. Multiple sets of the enormous footprints photographed on Jenkins' walls, some fresh enough that water still pooled in their depths. They led into the forest to the north, toward a ridgeline that Jenkins had marked repeatedly on his maps with the notation territory. Following procedure, I radioed Regional to report my findings. Manitou base to Regional. Over. Static then. Go ahead, Manitou. I'm finding some unusual tracks around the station. Large, bipedal, approximately 18 inches in length, requesting information on any known wildlife fitting that description in the area. A long pause. Manitou, those are likely bear tracks altered by rain or mud conditions. We recommend maintaining standard wildlife precautions and carrying bear spray during patrols. The dismissal was too quick, too practiced. Regional, these aren't bear tracks. They're clearly bipedal with 5 distinct toe impressions. The stride length suggests something very large moving on 2 legs. Manitou, this is Supervisor Blackwell. A new voice, male, authoritative. We've had reports of unusual tracks in that region for decades. Geological conditions create optical illusions in mud and soft ground. Focus on your assigned duties and avoid creating unnecessary concern. Clear? Crystal, sir, I replied, the tension in his voice raising more questions than his explanation answered. Additionally, we're issuing a directive to remove any unauthorized materials from the station walls. Former Ranger Jenkins was conducting unauthorized research. Pack it all for transport back to Regional at your next supply drop. Yes, sir. The radio clicked off before I could ask any further questions. I spent the afternoon exploring the immediate surroundings, finding more tracks leading to and from the lake's edge. Near the water, I discovered something that sent a chill through me. A half-eaten deer carcass, not torn apart by scavengers, but methodically butchered. The long bones had been cracked open, marrow extracted. Most disturbing were the clear tooth marks on what remained. Massive impressions that no known predator in these woods could make. That night, I loaded one of Jenkins' memory cards into my laptop. The footage showed weeks of nothing but wildlife, deer, elk, the occasional black bear, until the final recording. Timestamped at 2:14 a.m., just 3 days before Jenkins' departure. It showed a massive figure moving at the edge of the camera's range. The quality was poor, the lighting worse, but what I could see defied explanation. Bipedal, at least 8 feet tall, with long arms and a sloping forehead. It moved with purpose, stopping to sniff the air before turning directly toward the camera. For a brief moment, its eyes caught the infrared light, reflecting back as 2 glowing orbs in the darkness. Then it charged toward the camera with shocking speed. The footage ended with a violent shake as the camera was apparently knocked from its mounting. Sleep came fitfully that night. I woke repeatedly to sounds outside, branches snapping, heavy movement in the underbrush, and once what sounded like breathing directly outside my bedroom window. Dawn brought new discoveries. Something had disturbed the equipment shed behind the cabin, bending the metal door like tissue paper. Inside, I found paw prints in the dust. Not the massive footprints from before, but unmistakably canine tracks that seemed odd in a way I couldn't immediately identify. The radio crackled as I was documenting the damage. Manitou Base, this is Regional. We have a situation developing in your sector. Hikers reported missing yesterday. Family of 3 last seen entering Blackwater Trail. Their vehicle was found at the trailhead. Search and rescue team is mobilizing, but you're closest. Proceed to these coordinates and begin preliminary search patterns. The coordinates matched an area heavily marked on Jenkins' maps, deep in what he had labeled territory. I gathered emergency supplies, first aid kit, extra ammunition, and the rifle before heading out. The forest seemed to close around me as I moved deeper into the wilderness, following the coordinates on my GPS. The silence persisted. No wildlife, no birds, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and footsteps on the damp earth. 3 hours into my search, I found the first sign of the missing hikers, a child's stuffed animal hanging from a branch, deliberately placed at eye level, not dropped or lost, but carefully positioned to be seen. "Hello," I called out. "Park Ranger, If you can hear me, call out or make a noise." My voice echoed through the trees and faded into silence. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like a child crying somewhere ahead. I moved quickly toward the sound, pushing through dense underbrush until I reached a small clearing. The crying stopped abruptly. In the center of the clearing stood a crude structure, a teepee of sorts, constructed from broken tree limbs and covered with leaves and bark. Around it, the ground was trampled flat by repeated use. The missing family's belongings were scattered around the site. Backpacks torn open, clothing shredded, camping equipment crushed. But no sign of the hikers themselves. As I documented the scene, a powerful stench washed over me. Musky, animal, with undertones of decay. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as intuition screamed that I was being watched. Slowly, I turned toward the densest part of the surrounding forest. And there, partially obscured by the shadows between trees, stood a massive figure. It remained motionless, observing me from no more than 50 yards away. I raised my rifle instinctively, but something stopped me from lifting it fully. Some ancient part of my brain recognized a terrible truth. If I fired, if I showed aggression, whatever tenuous boundary existed between us would shatter. We remained locked in mutual observation for what felt like eternity. Finally, it made a sound. Not a growl or roar, but something almost like speech, a series of deep, guttural vocalizations that raised the hair on my arms. Then it was gone, melting into the forest with impossible silence for something so large. I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Regional, this is Manitou Base. I've found evidence of the missing hikers at these coordinates, but no sign of survivors. And Regional, I'm not alone out here. Regional, please respond. Over." I repeated into the radio, watching the tree line where the creature had disappeared. Static answered me. Either the dense forest was blocking transmission or something else was interfering. Night would fall within hours. Standing in the clearing beside the strange structure surrounded by the destroyed belongings of the missing family, I faced a decision: attempt to continue the search in darkness or return to the ranger station and resume at first light. The decision was made for me when I heard movement in the underbrush. Not the heavy footfalls of the creature I'd seen, but multiple smaller sources, closing in from different directions. I caught glimpses of low, dark shapes moving between trees. The canine tracks from the equipment shed suddenly made sense. The creature wasn't alone. It had companions, pack members. I broke into a run, abandoning stealth for speed, crashing through the forest back toward the direction of the ranger station. Behind me, something gave chase. The sound of multiple pursuers moving swiftly through the underbrush, flanking me, trying to cut off my escape route. A fallen tree provided momentary cover. I dropped behind it, rifle ready, as 3 wolf-like creatures emerged from the forest. But they weren't wolves. Their proportions were wrong. Faces too broad, front limbs too long. They moved with a terrible intelligence, spreading out to surround my position. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the forest, and the creatures hesitated, pulling back slightly. Using the moment, I ran again, pushing my body to its limits. The distant roof of the ranger station appeared through the trees as the last light faded from the sky. I stumbled onto the porch and through the door, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt. Seconds later, something heavy collided with the door. Once, twice, testing its strength. The radio crackled to life. "Manitou Base, this is Regional. Report your status immediately." I grabbed the handset. "Regional, I've returned to the station. The missing hikers' belongings were found torn apart. There's something out here. Multiple somethings. Large bipedal creature accompanied by canid pack hunters. They pursued me back to the station." "Ranger, listen carefully." Supervisor Blackwell's voice now. "Secure all doors and windows. Do not attempt to engage these entities. A security team is being dispatched to your location. ETA 6 hours. Maintain radio contact every 30 minutes. If contact is lost, we'll assume the station is compromised." "Sir, what exactly am I dealing with here?" I demanded. "You knew about this. Jenkins knew. Why wasn't I informed?" A long pause. "Those entities have been part of Manitou Peak since before recorded history. The indigenous people of the region had a name for the bipedal one. They called it the Lonely One. According to their legends, it was neither man nor animal, but something in between. Territorial, but not necessarily hostile unless provoked. And the wolf things? Not wolves. Not anymore. The legend says they were once wolves that followed the Lonely One for too long. Changed by proximity. Outside. Movement on the porch. Not the frantic scratching of the wolf creatures, but the measured tread of something much larger. "It's here," I whispered into the radio. "Do not engage," Blackwell repeated. The security team. The radio died suddenly, the lights following a second later. This time the generator didn't restart. Complete darkness enveloped the cabin, broken only by moonlight filtering through windows. 3 distinct knocks rattled the front door. I moved to the window, peering carefully around the edge of the curtain. It stood on the porch, taller than I'd estimated, at least 9 feet of matted fur and muscle. Not a costume, not a bear on hind legs, but something primordial and intelligent. Its breath fogged in the cold night air as it waited. It knocked again, the gesture unmistakably deliberate, almost civil. A memory surfaced, something from Jenkins' journal. It understands boundaries, territory. Respect these, and it sometimes respects yours. Understanding crystallized. The hikers had violated some boundary, entered its territory without showing proper respect. Jenkins had documented the boundaries, tried to understand the rules, and I had been sent in blind. With trembling hands, I unbolted the door and opened it just enough to see the creature clearly. Up close, its features became more distinct. A face somewhere between ape and human, deep-set eyes reflecting intelligence and something like curiosity. It made no move to attack. Instead, it slowly extended one massive hand, palm up, a gesture unmistakable across species boundaries. In its palm lay a child's shoe, unmistakably belonging to one of the missing hikers. A message. I have them. Are they alive? I asked, not expecting a response. It made that series of guttural sounds again. Not random noises, but patterned, intentional. Communication. It pointed toward the mountains, then held up 3 fingers before closing its hand into a fist. 3 people. Taken. The creature took a step back, watching me expectantly. It wanted something from me. A response. A decision. Understanding dawned. It hadn't come to attack, but to negotiate. Territories had been violated, boundaries crossed. Now it wanted to establish new boundaries, new understanding with the new human in its forest. I stepped fully onto the porch, rifle lowered, and met its gaze directly. Take me to them. The creature studied me for a long moment, then turned and lumbered down the steps, pausing at the edge of the forest to ensure I followed. The security team would arrive in hours, but by then they would find an empty ranger station. My path led into the darkness, following a legend made flesh, toward whatever truth awaited in the ancient shadows of Manitou Peak. What Jenkins had discovered, what I was now learning, was that the wilderness held more than just trees and animals. It contained old powers, old intelligences that demanded respect rather than fear, boundaries rather than bullets. As I followed the massive figure into the forest, I understood that my real work at Manitou Peak was just beginning. Not as a park ranger, but as something much older, an ambassador to a kingdom not found on any human map, negotiating peace with creatures that had watched our rise from the shadows of history. Behind us, the wolf things followed at a respectful distance, guardians of a forgotten sovereign guiding me deeper into a world where human rules no longer applied. Into a story much older and stranger than I had ever imagined. My first day at Manitou Peak had ended. My real education was about to begin. My name is Ayana, and I became a park ranger at Glacier National Park for the same reason most people run toward danger instead of away from it. Because someone I loved died there, and I needed answers. 3 years ago, my brother Coda vanished during a solo hiking trip on the Highline Trail. The official report listed him as another casualty of the wilderness, inexperienced hiker, poor weather conditions, probable fall into a ravine, case closed. But Coda had been hiking these mountains since he could walk. He knew every trail marker, every weather pattern, every dangerous drop-off in a 100-mile radius. The explanation never sat right with me, so when the ranger position opened at the remote Bowman Lake Station, I applied immediately. The posting was for a solo assignment, a cabin overlooking the lake, responsible for a 40-square-mile section of backcountry that saw maybe 24 visitors per season, perfect for someone who wanted to search without interference. The station supervisor, a weathered man named Joaquin, met me at the trailhead on my first day. His handshake was firm, but his eyes held a warning I couldn't quite interpret. "You sure about this assignment?" he asked, shouldering one of my supply packs. "It's isolated out there, real isolated. Last ranger lasted 8 months before he requested a transfer." "What happened to him?" Joaquin's jaw tightened. "Said he couldn't handle the quiet. Some people aren't cut out for that much solitude." The hike to the cabin took 3 hours through dense forest that grew progressively darker as we climbed. Ancient cedars towered overhead, their canopy so thick that midday felt like dusk. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and that particular smell of untouched wilderness, earth and moss and something indefinably wild. Bowman Lake appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, its surface like black glass reflecting the surrounding peaks. The water was so still it looked solid, unmarked by even the smallest ripple. The cabin sat on a small rise about 50 yards from the shore, a sturdy log structure with a wraparound porch and large windows facing the water. Radio works most of the time, Joaquin explained as we climbed the porch steps. Weather can interfere with transmission, so don't panic if you lose contact for a day or two. Supply drops happen every 2 weeks, weather permitting. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and an office area with maps covering every wall. Red pins marked hiking trails, blue ones marked campsites, and scattered black pins marked what the legend called incident locations. What kind of incidents? I asked. Joaquin paused in the doorway, pack still slung over his shoulder. Missing persons mostly, folks who wander off trail and get turned around. This terrain can be tricky. Lots of dead-end valleys and false ridges, easy to get confused, especially when the weather turns. He pointed to a cluster of black pins near the northern boundary of my patrol area. That section's had the most problems. Hikers report strange echoes, voices calling from the woods, usually just sound bouncing off the rock faces, but it can be disorienting. Keep that in mind if you get any lost hiker reports from that area. After Joaquin left, I spent the evening reviewing the incident files. Most were routine, day hikers who'd taken wrong turns, campers who'd gotten spooked by wildlife sounds and called for assistance. But buried in the stack, I found 3 reports that made my pulse quicken. The first was from 2 years ago. A couple camping near Hidden Lake reported hearing someone calling for help around midnight. They'd followed the voice deeper into the woods for almost an hour before realizing they'd lost the trail entirely. When they finally found their way back to camp at dawn, exhausted and scratched from bushwhacking through underbrush, they discovered their tent had been torn open and their food scattered. The second report was from last summer. A solo hiker claimed he'd been followed for 6 miles by someone calling his name. He never saw who it was, but the voice stayed just out of sight behind trees or around bends in the trail. When he finally reached the ranger station, he was nearly hysterical, insisting that the voice had known details about his life that no stranger could possibly know. The third report was filed just 4 months ago, 2 weeks before my predecessor had requested his transfer. A family of 4 had been camping at Bowman Lake when their youngest child, a 7-year-old girl, wandered away from their campsite. The parents found her 3 hours later, standing waist-deep in the lake, staring across the water. When they asked what she was doing, she said she'd been talking to her grandmother, who had died 2 years earlier. The grandmother had been calling to her from across the lake, telling her to come swimming. I set the files aside and walked out onto the porch. The lake stretched before me, perfectly still under a canopy of stars. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of civilization. Just the kind of deep quiet that made you strain your ears, searching for any sound to break the oppressive stillness. That's when I heard it. A faint call drifting across the water, too distant to make out words but unmistakably human. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the far shore, but the beam barely reached halfway across the lake. The sound came again, clearer this time. Ayana, my blood went cold. It was my name, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. Almost, but not quite. Like a familiar voice played through a broken radio, distorted just enough to make my skin crawl. I stood on that porch for 20 minutes, listening, but the voice didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an echo. Maybe another camper calling out, the sound bouncing off the water and rock faces until it reached me as a meaningless approximation of my name. But as I lay in bed that first night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the absolute silence outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those woods knew I was here. And more disturbing still, it knew who I was. I'd come to find answers about Koda's disappearance. Instead, I was beginning to suspect I'd walked into the same trap that had claimed him. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was the sound of footsteps on the porch outside, slow, deliberate steps that circled the cabin twice before stopping directly outside my bedroom window. But when I crept to the window and peered through the curtains, nothing was there except the empty darkness and the still black surface of the lake. My second day on the job brought my first real emergency. I was reviewing trail maps when the radio crackled to life around noon. Bowman Lake Station, this is base. We've got a missing hiker report, over. I grabbed the microphone. This is Ranger Ayana. Go ahead, base. 23-year-old male, name of Marcus Chen. Last seen yesterday morning heading north from Hidden Lake Campground. Planned to be back by evening. Family's worried. I traced the route on my map. Hidden Lake was about 8 miles northeast of my position, connected by a network of trails that wound through some of the most remote country in the park. If Chen had gotten lost up there, he could be anywhere within a 50-square-mile area. I'll head out immediately, I radioed back. EEA to Hidden Lake about 3 hours. Copy that. Be advised weather service is calling for possible thunderstorms this evening. Don't take any unnecessary risks. I packed my gear quickly. First aid kit, emergency shelter, extra food and water, GPS unit, flare gun. The hike to Hidden Lake took me through terrain that grew progressively wilder as I climbed. The lower trails were well maintained, but as I gained elevation, the path became rougher, marked only by occasional blazes carved into tree trunks. Hidden Lake sat in a cirque surrounded by towering granite walls. The campground was little more than a few cleared spaces near the shore where backpackers could pitch tents. I found Chen's abandoned campsite easily enough. A small dome tent, camp stove, and backpack sitting exactly where he'd left them. His sleeping bag was neatly rolled, his gear organized. Nothing suggested a hasty departure or struggle. I called out his name, listening as my voice echoed off the surrounding cliffs. The sound bounced back and forth, distorting until it no longer sounded like my voice at all. Then silence returned, thick and oppressive. Chen's trail led northeast from the campsite, following what appeared to be a game path rather than any official trail. I marked my GPS position and began tracking him, following broken twigs, disturbed vegetation, and the occasional boot print in soft earth. The trail led steadily upward through dense forest. After about 2 miles, I found the first sign that something was wrong. Chen's water bottle, half full, sitting upright on a fallen log as if carefully placed there. No hiker abandons water in the backcountry, especially not like this. I called his name again, louder this time. The echo came back strange, seeming to split into multiple voices calling from different directions. One of those voices sounded like it was answering, "Here, over here." The call came from somewhere ahead and to my left, off the main trail. I pushed through thick underbrush toward the sound, following what might have been a deer path. The voice called again, definitely male, definitely distressed. "Help me! I'm hurt!" I broke into a run, crashing through branches and jumping over fallen logs. The voice stayed ahead of me, always just out of sight around the next tree or over the next rise. It led me deeper into increasingly dense forest where the canopy blocked most of the sunlight and the air felt thick and still. "Where are you?" I shouted. "Here. Keep coming." But something was wrong with the voice. It was the same words, the same tone, but there was an artificial quality to it, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. I slowed, then stopped completely. I was standing in a small clearing surrounded by massive cedar trees. The voice had been coming from directly ahead, but there was no one there. No injured hiker, no signs of recent passage, just empty forest and in silence so complete it felt hostile. That's when I noticed the trees. Every cedar in the clearing had deep gouges in its bark, parallel scratches that ran from about 4 feet off the ground up to a height of 8 or 9 feet. The marks were fresh, the wood beneath still pale and wet. They looked like claw marks, but no bear or mountain lion was large enough to reach that high. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The response came from behind me. "Ayana." I spun around, hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. Nothing there but trees and shadows. But the voice had been close, maybe 20 feet away, and it had known my name. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, from somewhere off to my right, "This way, Ayana. I need help." The voice was different now. Still male, but older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. It was also coming from the opposite direction than before, which should have been impossible if it was the same person. I pulled out my GPS unit and checked my position. According to the device, I was more than a mile off any marked trail, in an area where the topographic map showed nothing but wilderness. Worse, I'd been following the voice for almost an hour and had somehow gained nearly 800 feet in elevation without realizing it. The terrain around me was all wrong for where I thought I was. The voice called again, closer now. "Ayana, please, I'm bleeding." But this time I heard something that made my skin crawl. The voice had a hollow quality, like someone speaking through a long tube, and underneath the words, almost too faint to detect, was another sound. A wet, clicking noise that definitely wasn't human. I backed away slowly, trying to retrace my path, but the forest around me looked completely unfamiliar. Every tree seemed identical, every shadow deeper and more threatening than before. I was lost, and something in these woods was using Chen's voice to lead me deeper into the wilderness. The radio on my belt crackled with static, then Joaquin's voice. "Bauman Lake Station, please respond, over." I fumbled for the microphone. "Base, this is Ayana. I'm tracking the missing hiker, but I may have a problem. Something's not right up here." "Say again? You're breaking up badly." I tried to respond, but the radio produced only static. I was on my own. The voice called out once more, and this time it was unmistakably Chen. "Ranger! Thank God! I'm down here." The sound was coming from somewhere below me, as if he'd fallen into a ravine. I approached carefully, scanning the ground for any drop-off or hole where someone might have fallen. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. At the base of the largest cedar tree was a small pile of belongings, a hiking boot, a torn piece of fabric that looked like it came from a jacket, and a wallet. I opened the wallet with trembling hands and found Marcus Chen's driver's license. The voice called again from directly beneath my feet. "Help me up. I can't climb out." But I was standing on solid ground. There was no ravine, no hole, nothing that could explain where the voice was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from underground, from somewhere deep beneath the forest floor. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, following my GPS back toward familiar territory. While behind me the voice kept calling, sometimes Chen's voice, sometimes others, sometimes a woman's voice that sounded terrifyingly like my own mother. They called my name, pleaded for help, described injuries and locations that couldn't possibly exist. By the time I made it back to Chen's campsite, the sun was setting and storm clouds were gathering overhead. I radioed for backup, then spent a sleepless night in my tent, listening to voices calling from the darkness, dozens of them all around the lake, all asking for help that I knew better than to provide. Marcus Chen was never found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. But I knew better. Whatever was in those woods had taken him, just like it had probably taken Koda, and now it knew I was here, and it was calling my name. The search for Marcus Chen was officially called off after 5 days, but I continued looking on my own time. I mapped every trail, every game path, every deer run within 10 miles of his last known location. What I found wasn't evidence of Chen, it was evidence of something far worse. The disappearances went back decades. Buried in old ranger reports, newspaper clippings, and missing person files, I found a pattern that should have been obvious to anyone who cared to look. Every 3 to 5 years, someone vanished in the same general area. The victims were always solo hikers, always experienced outdoorsmen, and always last heard calling for help before vanishing completely. I spread the documents across my cabin floor like pieces of a puzzle. 1987, John Reeves, experienced climber, disappeared while attempting a solo ascent. His climbing gear was found arranged neatly at the base of the cliff, but his body was never recovered. 1991, Patricia Voss, wildlife photographer, vanished while tracking a rare bird species. Her camera was found containing dozens of photos of empty forest, as if she'd been photographing something that didn't show up on film. 1995, Miguel Santos, park naturalist, went missing during a routine survey. His notes, found weeks later, described voices in the trees and something watching from the shadows. The pattern continued through the years, right up to Koda's disappearance 3 years ago. Each incident involved someone being lured off the established trails by voices calling for help. Each victim was found to have left behind personal items arranged in small, deliberate piles. And in every case, other hikers in the area reported hearing their names being called by unfamiliar voices. But the most disturbing discovery was what I found in the margins of Miguel Santos's field notes. His handwriting became increasingly erratic in the days before his disappearance, and his final entries described something that made my hands shake as I read them. Day 12. The voices are getting stronger. They know things about me, personal things. How is that possible? Day 13. Found another pile today. Fresh. Someone's been here recently, but I haven't seen anyone for 3 days. Day 14. They're not human. I don't know what they are, but they're not human. They can copy voices perfectly, but there's something wrong with the timing, like they're repeating recorded sounds. Day 15. I think they're feeding on something. The forest around the piles is different, healthier, greener, like the soil has been enriched. Day 16. They know I know. I can hear my own voice calling to me from the woods. If something happens to me, the answer is in the old growth section. Look for the feeding ground. The old growth section had to be the ancient cedar grove where I'd lost Chen's trail. I'd avoided that area since my first encounter, but if Santos was right, that's where I'd find answers. I spent 3 days preparing for the expedition. I couldn't rely on radio communication. The voices seemed to interfere with electronics somehow. Instead, I left detailed notes in my cabin describing my planned route and timeline. If I didn't return within 48 hours, anyone who found the notes would at least know where to start looking. The hike to the cedar grove took most of the morning. I approached cautiously, every sense alert for any sign of the presence I'd encountered before. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird songs, no insect sounds. Even the wind seemed muted. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. The grove looked different in daylight. The trees were even more massive than I'd remembered, their trunks easily 10 or 12 feet in diameter. But what caught my attention were the patterns in the bark. What I'd taken for claw marks were actually something else entirely, intricate spirals and geometric shapes carved deep into the living wood. The patterns were old, weathered smooth by decades of exposure, and they covered every tree in the grove. At the center of the grove was a depression in the earth about 20 feet across. The soil here was different, richer, darker, almost black, and scattered throughout the depression were dozens of personal items, hiking boots, jackets, cameras, water bottles, GPS units, all arranged in neat piles, all showing signs of having been there for different lengths of time. I was looking at a feeding ground. I approached the nearest pile carefully, using a stick to turn over the items without touching them directly. A moldy hiking boot, a rusted compass, a wallet so decomposed I couldn't open it. These weren't recent losses, they'd been here for years. That's when I heard it. A wet, sliding sound coming from somewhere above me. I looked up into the canopy and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was moving between the branches 40 feet overhead. It was roughly human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too long, too pale, moving in ways that defied anatomy. Its limbs bent at impossible angles as it flowed through the branches like liquid, never quite solid enough to get a clear look at. Then it spoke, and its voice was Marcus Chen's. "Ayana, you found me. I'm hurt bad. Can you climb up here?" I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the thing in the trees. It moved to stay directly above me, shifting from branch to branch without ever making the kind of noise a living creature should make moving through dry leaves and twigs. "Please," it said, and now the voice was Koda's. "I've been waiting for you. I knew you'd come looking for me." The voice was perfect. Not just Koda's words, but his inflection, his accent, even the slight raspiness he'd developed after breaking his nose in a climbing accident. If I'd heard it over the phone, I would have sworn it was him. "You're not Koda?" I said aloud. "I am," it replied, and I could hear the smile in the voice. "I'm everyone who's come here. We all become part of the same thing. You can join us, Ayana. It doesn't hurt." More shapes appeared in the canopy around me. Pale, flowing forms that moved between the trees like living shadows. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. And they were all speaking now. A chorus of stolen voices calling my name, pleading with me, promising me things I'd always wanted to hear. My mother's voice. "I'm so proud of you, honey." Koda's voice. "I never blamed you for what happened." My father's voice. "Come home, Ayana. We're all here." But underneath the familiar voices was that same wet, clicking sound I'd heard before. The real sound these things made when they weren't pretending to be human. I understood now why the other victims had been lured off the trails. The voices weren't just mimicry, they were psychologically targeted. offering exactly what each person most wanted to hear. For a lost hiker, it would be rescue. For someone searching for a missing loved one, it would be reunion. The creatures fed on human desire, using it to draw their prey into the feeding ground. But I also understood something else. They couldn't leave the grove. All the disappearances had happened within a 5-mile radius of this spot. The creatures were bound to this place somehow, dependent on it. They could project their voices farther, but they couldn't venture beyond their territory. The voices were getting more insistent now, more desperate. They sensed I was about to leave. "Don't go," Koda's voice pleaded. "You've searched for so long. Don't you want to know what really happened to me?" I did want to know, more than anything. But I also knew that whatever these things were, they weren't offering knowledge. They were offering consumption. The feeding ground wasn't just where they brought their prey. It was where they absorbed them, adding their voices to the choir that would lure the next victim. I started backing toward the edge of the grove, and the voices became frantic. They overlapped now, dozens of people I'd known calling my name simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming, disorienting, but I forced myself to keep moving. At the edge of the grove, I turned and ran. Behind me, the voices faded to angry whispers, then to the wet clicking sounds, then finally to silence. I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin. Only then did I realize that my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I'd found the feeding ground. I'd learned what happened to the missing hikers, but I still didn't know how to stop it, and I knew with absolute certainty that the creatures wouldn't give up. They'd tasted my presence now, heard my voice. They would find a way to call me back. The only question was whether I'd be strong enough to resist when they did. After my encounter at the feeding ground, I should have reported what I'd found and requested immediate transfer. Any sane person would have. Instead, I began researching everything I could find about the history of Glacier National Park, focusing specifically on the area around Bowman Lake. What I discovered in the archives at park headquarters made me understand that this problem was far older and more complex than I'd imagined. The Blackfeet tribe had lived in this region for thousands of years before the park was established. Their oral histories, recorded by anthropologists in the early 1900s, contained repeated references to an area they called the Hungry Place, a grove of ancient trees where voices of the dead could be heard calling to the living. According to the stories, the trees themselves were alive in a way that normal plants were not, and they sustained themselves by consuming the life force of anyone foolish enough to enter their domain. The Blackfeet had specific rituals for dealing with the Hungry Place. They would leave offerings at the edge of the grove, food, tools, personal items to appease whatever lived there. Most importantly, they taught their children never to follow voices calling from the deep forest, no matter how familiar they sounded. But when the area became a national park in 1910, that traditional knowledge was dismissed as primitive superstition. The new park rangers were educated men from back east who believed in science and rational thought. They had no time for Native American folklore. The first recorded disappearance occurred in 1913, just 3 years after the park opened. A government surveyor named Robert Hayes vanished while mapping the northern boundary. His equipment was found neatly arranged at the base of a large cedar tree, but his body was never recovered. The official report blamed a bear attack, despite the complete absence of any evidence of predation. Similar incidents occurred every few years throughout the early decades of the park's history. Each time, the official explanation was wildlife encounter, exposure, or equipment failure. The pattern was never acknowledged because no one wanted to admit that there might be something in the wilderness that science couldn't explain. But buried in the old files, I found evidence that some people had tried to take action. In 1934, a ranger named Henry Crow Dog, himself of Blackfeet descent, had submitted a formal report requesting that the cedar grove be declared off-limits to visitors. His report detailed 7 disappearances over a 20-year period and included maps showing the exact boundaries of what he called the affected area. Crow Dog's report was rejected by park administration, and he was quietly transferred to a different post. The grove remained open to the public, and the disappearances continued. I spent hours studying Crow Dog's maps, comparing them to current topographical surveys. His affected area corresponded almost exactly to the region where I'd been tracking unusual incidents. More importantly, his notes included detailed observations about the creature's behavior and limitations. According to Crow Dog, the entities were most active during certain lunar phases and weather conditions. They seemed to feed on emotional energy as well as physical presence, which explained why they targeted people who were psychologically vulnerable, the lost, the grieving, the desperate, and they were bound to their territory by some kind of symbiotic relationship with the ancient cedar trees. But the most important detail in Crow Dog's notes was a reference to the choir growing stronger. He'd observed that each new victim increased the creature's range and power. They weren't just consuming people, they were adding their voices to some kind of collective consciousness that became more persuasive and more dangerous with each feeding. This information gave me hope. If the creatures were bound to the grove and dependent on the trees, there might be a way to weaken or contain them. But first, I needed to understand the current extent of their influence. I began monitoring radio communications throughout the park, listening for any reports of unusual incidents. What I discovered was terrifying. The affected area was expanding. Over the past month, there had been reports of strange voices and disorienting echoes from locations up to 8 miles from the cedar grove. The creature's influence was growing, and it was only a matter of time before they claimed another victim. That victim turned out to be closer than I'd expected. 3 weeks after my encounter at the feeding ground, I received a radio call from a day hiker named Rebecca Walsh. She'd gotten separated from her group near Akokala Lake, about 6 miles from my station. She was scared, cold, and running low on water. "Can you see any landmarks?" I asked her over the radio. "I'm in a valley with really tall trees," she said. "Cedar trees, I think. There's a clearing in the middle." My blood went cold. She was in the grove. "Rebecca, listen to me very carefully. You need to leave that area immediately. Don't investigate any sounds you hear. Don't follow any voices. Just get out of there as fast as you can." "What? Why? What's wrong?" Before I could answer, her transmission cut to static. I tried calling her back, but got no response. I was already throwing gear into my pack when the radio crackled again. "Hello? Is anyone there?" It was Rebecca's voice, but there was something off about it. A slight delay, like she was repeating words she'd heard a moment before. "Rebecca, where are you?" "I'm hurt," the voice said. "I fell down and I think I broke my ankle. I'm in the clearing with the tall trees. Can you come help me?" But Rebecca had just told me she was fine except for being lost and low on water. She hadn't mentioned any injury. I was listening to something else wearing her voice. "Where exactly are you hurt?" I asked, testing my theory. "I'm hurt," the voice repeated, exactly the same tone and inflection. "I fell down and I think I broke my ankle." It was playing back her words like a recording, unable to improvise or respond to specific questions. The creature had Rebecca, and it was using her voice to try to lure me into the grove. I had 2 choices. Call for backup and let the official search and rescue teams walk into the same trap that had claimed every other victim, or go in alone and try to extract Rebecca before the creatures could consume her completely. I chose the third option. I decided to end this. I loaded my pack with everything I thought I might need. Flare gun, emergency flares, camp fuel, climbing rope, first aid kit, and my grandfather's old hunting knife. If Henry Crow Dog was right about the creatures being dependent on the trees, maybe I could find a way to sever that connection. The hike to the grove took 2 hours, and I heard Rebecca's voice calling for help the entire way. Sometimes it was her original plea for assistance, sometimes variations that sounded like responses to questions I wasn't asking. The creatures were trying to create a conversation, but they could only work with the sounds they'd captured. As I approached the grove, I heard something that made me stop cold. My own voice, calling Rebecca's name. They'd been listening to my radio transmissions, recording my voice just as they'd recorded hers. Soon they'd be able to imitate me perfectly, and the next person who came looking would hear both Rebecca and me calling for help. I circled the grove until I found what I was looking for. A game trail that led to the edge of the depression where the feeding ground was located. I could see movement in the canopy overhead, pale shapes flowing between the branches like living smoke. And there, in the center of the depression, was Rebecca. She was standing perfectly still, looking up at the trees with an expression of wonder on her face. She appeared unharmed, but there was something wrong with the way she was breathing. Too slow, too shallow, as if she was falling asleep on her feet. "Rebecca!" I called from the edge of the grove. She turned toward me, and I saw that her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible eye. When she spoke, her voice was layered with other sounds, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "Join us," she said. "It's peaceful here. We're all together now." The creatures had started the process of absorbing her, but it wasn't complete yet. If I could get her out of the grove quickly, there might still be time to save her. I pulled out my flare gun and fired directly into the canopy above Rebecca. The magnesium flare burst among the branches in an explosion of white light, and the creatures reacted immediately. They poured down from the trees like liquid shadow, flowing across the ground toward me in a wave of pale, writhing forms. But they stopped at the edge of the grove, unable or unwilling to leave the boundary of their territory. They clustered at the perimeter, reaching toward me with appendages that weren't quite arms, making that wet clicking sound that was their true voice. Rebecca was still standing in the center of the depression, but the flare seemed to have broken whatever hold they'd had on her. She looked around in confusion, then saw me and stumbled in my direction. "Run!" I shouted. "Don't look back, just run." She made it halfway to the edge before the creatures began their final gambit. Every voice they'd ever captured started calling at once, a chorus of the dead that rose from the grove like a physical force. I heard my parents, my grandparents, Coda, Marcus Chen, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. They promised everything I'd ever wanted, offered everything I'd ever lost, pleaded with me to join them in their eternal communion. The sound was overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus on Rebecca. She was close enough to reach now, and I grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the grove. The moment we crossed the boundary, the voices stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Rebecca collapsed, unconscious but breathing normally. Her eyes had returned to their natural color, and her pulse was strong. I carried her to a safe distance from the grove, then radioed for medical evacuation. As we waited for the helicopter, I looked back at the cedar trees. The creatures were still there, clustered at the edge of their territory, watching us with alien intelligence. I'd saved Rebecca, but I hadn't solved the problem. They were still hungry, still growing stronger, still adding voices to their choir. But I'd learned something important. They could be fought. They had limitations, boundaries, weaknesses, and if Henry Crow Dog had been right about their dependence on the trees, maybe there was a way to break their hold on this place permanently. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Rebecca Walsh spent 3 days in the hospital under observation, with no memory of her time in the grove beyond entering the clearing and feeling incredibly peaceful. The doctors attributed her condition to mild hypothermia and dehydration, and she was released with instructions to avoid strenuous hiking for a few weeks. I visited her before she left town, hoping to learn more about what she'd experienced, but her description was frustratingly vague. She remembered the trees seeming to whisper to her, feeling like she belonged there, and a sense that she was part of something larger than herself. When I pressed for details, she became agitated and changed the subject. "I don't want to think about it," she said finally. "Whatever happened in there, it wasn't natural. I keep having dreams where I'm back in those trees and everyone I've ever loved is there with me. The dreams feel more real than being awake." That confirmed my suspicions about how the creatures operated. They didn't just mimic voices. They created psychological experiences so compelling that their victims actively wanted to stay. Rebecca had been lucky that my intervention broke their hold before the process was complete. Others hadn't been so fortunate. I returned to my research with new urgency. If the creature's influence was expanding and their choir was growing stronger with each victim, it was only a matter of time before they claimed someone else. I needed to find a way to stop them permanently. The answer came from an unexpected source, a journal hidden in the basement archives of the park's administrative building. It belonged to Henry Crow Dog, the ranger who tried to close the grove in 1934. His family had donated his personal papers to the park after his death in 1967, but they'd been misfiled and forgotten. Crow Dog's journal contained 40 years of observations about the creatures, written in a mixture of English and Blackfeet. I had to find a tribal historian to help translate some passages, but what I learned changed everything. According to Crow Dog, the creatures weren't native to this place. They were parasites that had arrived sometime in the late 1800s, drawn by the spiritual energy that the Blackfeet had concentrated in the grove through generations of ritual use. The ancient cedars had been sacred trees, places where the tribe communicated with their ancestors. The creatures had corrupted this connection, feeding on the spiritual energy and using it to power their own twisted form of consciousness. But the most important discovery was Crow Dog's description of a ritual the Blackfeet had used to cleanse corrupted spiritual sites. It involved severing the connection between the parasites and their host environment through a combination of fire, sacred smoke, and what he called the returning of voices. The journal included detailed instructions for the ritual, along with warnings about the dangers involved. According to Crow Dog, anyone attempting the cleansing would become the focus of the creature's full attention. They would use every voice in their choir to try to stop the ritual, and if they succeeded, the person performing it would become their most powerful victim yet. I spent a week gathering the materials Crow Dog had specified: sage from a specific valley, cedar bark from trees that had never been touched by the parasites, and most crucially, recordings of the creature's stolen voices. This last requirement had puzzled me until I realized what Crow Dog meant by returning of voices. I needed to play back the creature's mimicry to break their hold on the sounds they'd stolen. I'd been recording the voices I heard during my patrols, and I had hours of audio captured during my encounters with the creatures. If Crow Dog was right, playing these recordings back at the grove would force the creatures to release their hold on the stolen voices, weakening their power and breaking their connection to the trees. The ritual had to be performed during the new moon, when the creature's influence was at its weakest. I had 3 days to prepare. On the night of the new moon, I hiked to the grove carrying a portable speaker, Crow Dog's ritual materials, and enough fuel to burn the entire grove if necessary. The forest was darker than I'd ever seen it, with cloud cover blocking even the stars. I used my flashlight sparingly, relying mostly on my knowledge of the trails to guide me. The grove was silent when I arrived, but I could sense the creatures watching from the canopy. They knew I was coming. I'd made no attempt to hide my approach. Let them know. Let them prepare. It wouldn't matter. I set up the speaker at the edge of the grove and began the ritual exactly as Crow Dog had described. First, I lit a bundle of sage and walked the perimeter of the grove, letting the smoke drift between the trees. The creatures reacted immediately, flowing down from the canopy in agitation, but they still couldn't cross the boundary. Next, I scattered cedar bark in a pattern around the feeding ground, forming what Crow Dog had called the circle of return. The creatures were making their clicking sounds now, a chattering that rose in pitch and intensity as they sensed what I was doing. Finally, I activated the speaker and began playing back the recorded voices. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Every creature in the grove began screaming, not with stolen human voices, but with their true sound, a wet shrieking that seemed to come from multiple mouths at once. It poured across the ground toward me in a wave of pale flesh and impossible limbs, but when they reached the circle of cedar bark, they recoiled as if burned. The voices coming from the speaker began to change. What had been perfect mimicry started to distort, becoming layered with the creature's real sounds. I could hear Marcus Chen's voice separating from the clicking underneath it, becoming clearer and more distinct. Then Koda's voice, then dozens of others I didn't recognize. The creatures were losing their hold on the stolen sounds, but they weren't giving up without a fight. As each voice separated from their collective, they launched it back at me with desperate intensity. I heard every person I'd ever lost pleading with me to stop the ritual. My parents begged me to join them. Koda promised to explain everything if I would just cross the circle and embrace him. The psychological assault was overwhelming. Part of me wanted nothing more than to step into the grove and reunite with everyone I'd loved and lost. But I forced myself to remember Rebecca's black eyes, the neat piles of belongings in the feeding ground, the decades of victims who'd followed similar promises into oblivion. The ritual was working. With each freed voice, the creatures became more desperate, more frantic. They began throwing themselves against the circle with increasing violence, their forms becoming less cohesive as their power weakened. Some of them were actually dissolving, unable to maintain their shape without the stolen energy that had sustained them. Then I heard something that nearly broke my resolve. Koda's voice, but different from before. Clearer, more real. "Ayana," he said, and this time there was no clicking underneath it, no artificial delay. "Thank you. I can see the path now. I can go home." One by one, the freed voices spoke their final words. Some thanked me, others simply said goodbye. A few warned me about other places where similar creatures might be feeding, but all of them sounded peaceful, relieved, finally free to move on to whatever came next. As the last voice faded, the creatures let out a collective shriek that shattered the windows on my speaker. Then they began to collapse inward, their forms dissolving into puddles of pale liquid that soaked into the earth. Within minutes, there was nothing left of them but strange stains on the forest floor. The ancient cedars themselves began to change. The carved patterns in their bark faded and disappeared. Their leaves, which had always seemed too green and vibrant for the environment, dulled to normal colors. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the grove for over a century lifted like fog in sunlight. I completed the ritual by lighting a small fire in the center of the feeding ground and burning the remaining cedar bark. According to Crow Dog's instructions, this would purify the soil and prevent any remnant of the creatures from taking root again. As the fire burned, I scattered the ashes of the personal belongings I'd found in the feeding ground, the final remains of the creatures' victims. They deserved a proper ending, not eternal servitude to parasitic entities that wore their voices like masks. By dawn, it was over. The grove looked like an ordinary patch of forest, beautiful but no longer threatening. Birds were singing in the canopy for the first time since I'd started working in the area. The air smelled clean and fresh, without the underlying corruption that had tainted it before. I hiked back to my cabin as the sun rose, exhausted but satisfied. I'd done what I came here to do. I'd found out what happened to Coda, and I'd made sure it wouldn't happen to anyone else. The official report I filed described the grove as geologically unstable and recommended that it be closed to public access. Park administration accepted my recommendation without question. They were more concerned about liability than they were about losing access to a remote section of wilderness that few people visited anyway. I stayed on as a ranger for another 6 months, making sure the grove remained quiet and that no new incidents occurred in the surrounding area. During that time, I met with several tribal elders and returned copies of Henry Crow Dog's journal to his family. They weren't surprised that the hungry place had finally been cleansed. They'd been waiting for someone to complete Crow Dog's work for almost 90 years. When I finally left Glacier National Park, I took with me the knowledge that there are things in the wilderness that science doesn't understand, and that some places hold dangers that can only be fought with wisdom older than our civilization. I also carried the voices of everyone who'd thanked me in those final moments, proof that some forms of rescue can reach across the boundary between life and death. I still work as a park ranger, though in different locations now. And sometimes when I'm alone in the deep woods, I listen carefully to the sounds around me, because I know that what I found in Glacier's shadow wasn't unique. There are other hungry places, other parasites wearing familiar voices, other choirs of the lost waiting for someone to set them free. The wilderness keeps its secrets, but some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some voices are too precious to let fade into the darkness without a fight. In the end, that's what being a ranger really means. Standing guard not just against the natural dangers of the wild, but against the unnatural ones that hide in places where the maps end and the real world begins.